Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been putting off writing this down for a long time. Over 40 years, to be exact. Some things stay with you, no matter how much time passes. I'm 67 now, and I still wake up in cold sweats sometimes, thinking about what happened that day in '78. I figure I should get this off my chest while I still can. I was 23 at the time, newly married to my wife Sarah, who came from Braxton County, West Virginia. Her folks had this small farm near Burnsville. About 70 acres, mostly on a wooded hillside. It wasn't much, but it had good hunting. I'd been bow hunting since I was a teenager, and back then, I thought I knew those woods better than anyone. That November day started like any other hunting trip. I got up before dawn, dressed in my camo, grabbed my compound bow and headed out. The air was crisp, maybe low 40s, with that earthy smell of fallen leaves. The kind of perfect hunting weather you pray for. I remember feeling good that morning, confident. My father-in-law had told me about a spot at the top of the ridge where deer frequently crossed. I'd been there a few times before, so I knew the route. It was about a 1.5 mile hike from the farmhouse, following this old dirt logging road that wound its way up the hillside. The terrain was typical Appalachian, steep in places, dense forest with occasional clearings. I reached the top of the ridge around 8:30 a.m. The sun was up by then, filtering through the trees and creating those long shadows across the ground. I was walking slowly, scanning for any sign of deer, when I spotted something about 250 yards away. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. There was something big and black on the ground near a cluster of rhododendron bushes. From that distance, it looked like a large black mass, maybe a bear bedded down. But something felt off about it. The shape wasn't quite right. I froze and just watched. The thing was positioned strangely, almost like a person sitting with their knees up and head down. I remember thinking it might be a hunter in a blind, but who would wear all black during deer season? Then it moved. It stood up, not like a bear would stand up, not on all fours first, then to its hind legs. This thing stood up just like you or I would, directly from sitting to standing in one fluid motion. Human-like, but wrong. So wrong. My first thought was that someone was playing a prank. November in deer season, someone dressed in a costume trying to scare hunters. I actually called out, "Hey, you're going to get yourself shot wearing that during hunting season." My voice echoed across the ridge. It didn't respond. Instead, it turned toward me and started walking. Not running, not charging, just walking with purpose. Each stride it took covered about 5 feet of ground. That's when the first real chill hit me. No one walks like that. No human, anyway. As it got closer, maybe 200 yards away now, I could see its proportions better. This thing was massive, at least 9 feet tall. Its arms hung down almost to its knees. The sunlight was hitting it directly now, and I could see it wasn't wearing a costume. What I was looking at was covered in black hair, about 4 inches long all over its body, with longer hair sticking out around the shoulders. I stood frozen, my bow hanging useless at my side. I couldn't move, couldn't think clearly. Every instinct was screaming danger, but my body wouldn't respond. At about 150 yards, I could see its face. God, that face. I'll never forget it as long as I live. It wasn't like a gorilla or an ape. It was more human-like, but distorted. The skin was this deep, black, leathery texture with bold cracks in it, like old leather that's been left in the sun too long. The face was long, surrounded by that same black hair, but the expression, there was intelligence there. And something else, something mean, something brutal. Our eyes met across that distance, and I felt something I'd never felt before or since. Pure primal terror, Not fear like when you're startled or afraid of getting hurt. This was deeper, more ancient, like prey, recognizing a predator on some cellular level. That's when my body finally responded. I turned and ran. I've never been an athletic guy, but that day I ran like my life depended on it, because I truly believed it did. I abandoned the logging road and just crashed downhill through the forest, stumbling over rocks and fallen trees, branches whipping my face. I didn't dare look back. The only thought in my head was getting back to the farmhouse, back to safety. I remember the sound of my own breathing, ragged and desperate. The pounding of my heart was so loud in my ears I couldn't hear if it was following me. My bow caught on branches as I ran, but I wouldn't let go of it. It was the only weapon I had. The downhill run was treacherous. I slipped multiple times, falling hard once and slicing my hand open on a sharp rock. I didn't even feel the pain until hours later. I just scrambled back up and kept going. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15-20 minutes of panicked running, I broke through the tree line into the cleared area around my in-laws' farmhouse. I nearly collapsed right there in the field, my legs like jelly, lungs burning, gasping for air. My father-in-law was on the porch and saw me come staggering out of the woods. He later told me he thought I'd been attacked by a bear from the state I was in, white as a sheet, bleeding, barely able to stand. "What happened? Are you hurt?" he asked as he helped me onto the porch. I couldn't speak at first, just gasping and pointing back toward the ridge. When I finally caught enough breath to talk, all I could get out was, "There's something up there, something big." We went inside and I gulped down water while trying to explain what I'd seen. As I spoke, I could see the change in my father-in-law's face. He wasn't dismissing me or laughing it off. He was listening with this grave expression that only made my fear worse. "You're not the first," he finally said. "There've been stories around these parts for years." That's when he told me about other sightings in Braxton County over the decades. Locals had experiences they didn't talk about much, especially not to outsiders. Strange sounds in the night, livestock acting nervous for no reason, and occasionally glimpses of something large moving through the trees. I spent the rest of that day in a daze. My hand needed stitches, but I refused to go to the hospital. I didn't want to leave the safety of the house. Sarah cleaned and bandaged it as best she could while I sat at the kitchen table, jumping at every sound outside. That night was the worst. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every rustle of wind in the trees outside had me sitting bolt upright, convinced it had followed me back, that it was outside, waiting. I kept seeing that face when I closed my eyes, that leathery, cracked skin, those eyes that seemed to bore right through me. The next morning, my father-in-law wanted to go up to the ridge to look for tracks. I flat out refused. There was no way I was going back there. Never again. He went with his brother instead, taking rifles with them. They returned a few hours later saying they'd found some unusual tracks, much larger than a human's, but nothing conclusive. I packed up and we left that afternoon. I made excuses about my injured hand, about needing to get back to work, anything to justify leaving early. The truth was, I couldn't stand being there another night. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a bear walking upright. Maybe it was just another hunter, and my mind played tricks on the proportions. Maybe I'd worked myself up over nothing. But deep down, I knew. What I saw that day wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered before. The locals call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but those names seem almost silly compared to the reality of what I saw. They make it sound like some gentle giant from children's stories. What I encountered had malice in its eyes. I never went bow hunting on that property again. Never went back to those woods at all, actually. Sarah thought I was being ridiculous at first, but she stopped questioning it when she noticed the nightmares I'd have. For years after, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, that leathery face vivid in my mind. I still hunt occasionally, but never alone, and never without a sidearm. I carry a .44 Magnum revolver now, Probably wouldn't stop whatever that thing was, but it gives me some comfort. And I stick to open fields and familiar territory, places where I can see a long way in every direction. I've only told this story a handful of times over the years. Most people look at me like I'm crazy or drunk, or both. A few have shared similar experiences, though none as clear or as close as mine. There's a knowing look that passes between people who've seen something they can't explain, a look that says, "You know it's real too, don't you?" The scientific part of my brain still tries to explain it away sometimes. But then I remember the way it moved, the intelligence in those eyes, and that deep sense of ancient terror I felt. No known animal could have caused that reaction in me. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I know what I saw. That thing was real, and it's probably still out there in those West Virginia hills. I just hope our paths never cross again. To this day, I can't explain exactly what happened on that ridge. All I know is that it changed me forever. There are things in this world we don't understand, things we maybe aren't meant to understand, and sometimes ignorance really is bliss. But when you've seen it with your own eyes, well, you can't unsee it. You just learn to live with the knowledge that we're not alone out there in the woods. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night and the house is quiet, I swear I can feel it watching me still from somewhere out in the darkness. Story 2. I've been hunting my entire life. Every fall since I was 12, my dad and I would head out to the same patch of woods in Jackson County. It's a family tradition going back to my grandfather. We know those woods like the back of our hands. Every ridge, every creek, every good spot where the deer tend to travel. Last November started like any other hunting season. Dad and I got up at 4 a.m., had our usual breakfast of eggs and coffee at the kitchen table while going over our plan one more time. We'd been tracking a nice 8-point buck on our trail cams for weeks, and I was hoping this would be the day. The morning was crisp, maybe 35 degrees with that kind of stillness that's perfect for hunting. You could hear a twig snap from 100 yards away in that kind of quiet. We parked the truck at our usual spot, gathered our gear, and made the half-mile hike to our stands in the dark, using red-filtered headlamps to preserve our night vision. Our stands were on opposite sides of this small hill, maybe 200 yards apart as the crow flies. Dad took the east side, where there's a natural funnel that deer use when moving from their bedding area to the creek. I took the west side, overlooking a small clearing where they often pause to browse. We always set up like this to cover more ground. Our stands are pretty high, about 30 feet up, because Dad always says the higher you are, the less likely deer will wind you. I climbed up, secured my safety harness, and settled in for the wait. Dawn came slowly, painting the trees gold as the first real light filtered through. Nothing much happened during those early hours. I saw a few squirrels, a raccoon, the usual woodland creatures going about their business. Around 11:30, I was starting to get that midday lull. You know how it is. You've been sitting motionless for hours, and your mind starts to wander. I was actually thinking about whether I should eat my sandwich or wait another hour when movement caught my eye at the edge of the clearing. 3 does stepped out cautiously. They were moving slowly, stopping every few steps to raise their heads and test the air. Normal deer behavior, but something seemed off. They were tense, more alert than usual. I raised my binoculars to get a better look. That's when I noticed they kept looking back over their shoulders toward the thicker part of the forest. They weren't just being cautious, they were scared of something. I assumed it might be a coyote or maybe even a black bear, both of which we have plenty of in these parts. I set down my binoculars and picked up my rifle, a Remington 30-06 that had been my dad's before he passed it down to me. Through the scope, I followed the does as they moved across the clearing, still watching for whatever might come after them. When I saw it, my first thought was that another hunter had wandered onto our property. But that didn't make sense, because we own these 80 acres, and the neighboring land is posted too. Plus, No hunter in their right mind would be walking upright in the middle of the day during deer season. The figure stepped out from between two large oaks about 100 yards from my position. It was tall, much taller than me, and I'm 6'1". Through my scope, I could make out details that made my blood run cold. This wasn't a person, not in any normal sense. It stood upright on two legs, but it was massive, 7 feet tall at least. It was covered in hair, not fur like a bear, but long matted hair, dark brown or maybe reddish brown in places, covering its entire body except for parts of its face. And the face, God, the face is what still gives me nightmares. It had a large, broad face with a prominent brow ridge that shadowed its eyes. The nose was large and sunken in, almost like it had been smashed flat. The eyes were set deep, and through my scope, I could see they were a disturbing reddish-brown color. Not like any animal I've ever hunted. Its mouth was slightly open, and I could see yellowish, flat teeth. Not fangs like a predator, but not like human teeth either. Just wrong. The whole proportions were off. It had a thick neck that seemed to merge directly into its shoulders without much definition, and its arms hung longer than a human's would, reaching almost to its knees. The build was stocky and powerful. Not fat, but incredibly muscular, like a linebacker crossed with a gorilla. It moved with a strange gait, fluid yet awkward at the same time, as if walking upright wasn't completely natural for it. And the smell. Even from my position in the tree stand, an unnatural stench drifted up, like wet, rotting fur mixed with something sour and musky. It was so distinct and foul that I could taste it in the back of my throat. I froze completely. My finger was on the trigger guard of my rifle, but I couldn't move. Part of me was trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was someone in a costume. But who would be in these remote woods wearing something like that? And no costume could explain the smell or the way it moved. The creature paused at the edge of the clearing, watching the does as they bounded away in panic. It seemed to be sniffing the air, turning its head slowly from side to side. Then it looked in my general direction. That's when a surge of adrenaline broke through my paralysis. I don't know what possessed me, but I shouted out, "Hey, you! Take that mask off!" My voice came out higher and shakier than I meant it to. The thing's reaction was immediate. Its head snapped toward me with unnatural speed, locking those reddish eyes directly on my position. No person in a costume could have spotted me so quickly in my camouflage 30 feet up a tree. It let out a sound that I will never forget. Not a roar like a bear or a scream like a person, but a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the forest. It was too complex to be an animal sound, but too primal to be human. The closest thing I could compare it to would be if someone took a human growl and played it at half speed through a broken speaker. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even keep my rifle steady. The creature stared at me for what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds. I had the overwhelming sensation that it was considering whether to come for me or not. I've been face to face with angry black bears before, but I've never felt the kind of primal terror that flooded through me at that moment. Then, without warning, it turned and moved, and God, the speed of it. No human could move like that. It didn't run like a person or even like a bear. It was almost like it bounded, covering ground in huge, powerful strides. It went straight over the hill toward the area where my dad was hunting. I immediately fumbled for my radio, trying to warn him, but my hands were shaking so badly I dropped it. By the time I retrieved it from where it had landed on a branch below my feet, I realized with horror that I'd forgotten to turn it on that morning after charging it. I couldn't leave my dad out there with that thing heading toward him. I unclipped my safety harness with trembling hands and practically slid down the ladder of my tree stand, scraping my palms raw in the process. I didn't even feel the pain until hours later. When my boots hit the ground, I hesitated. Every instinct was screaming at me to run back to the truck, but I couldn't abandon my dad. I raised my rifle and started moving as quickly and quietly as I could toward his stand. The forest felt different now, threatening in a way it never had before in all my years of hunting. Every shadow might be hiding that thing. Every sound might be it circling back. The taste of fear in my mouth was metallic and sharp. It took me about 15 minutes to reach my dad's stand, moving as fast as I dared while still trying to stay quiet. When I got there, I saw him still up in his stand, rifle raised, scanning the woods intently. "Dad!" I hissed up at him, trying to keep my voice low. He nearly jumped out of his skin. "Jesus Christ, son, you scared the hell out of me. What are you doing over here? Did you get something?" He started climbing down. When he reached the ground, one look at my face told him something was wrong. "What happened? You're white as a sheet." I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words came tumbling out in a jumbled mess. There was this thing, not a man, not a bear. It walked like a person, but it wasn't. It was huge, Dad, with these eyes and teeth and the smell. Dad put his hand on my shoulder to calm me down. "Slow down. What exactly did you see?" I took a deep breath and described it as clearly as I could. The height, the hair, the face, everything. As I spoke, I saw his expression change from concern to something else. Not disbelief exactly, but caution. "Did you see it?" I finally asked. "It came this way." Dad was quiet for a moment, then said, "I saw something moving through the trees about 10 minutes ago. It was fast, just glimpses between the trunks. I thought it might be a bear, but it didn't move quite right. Never got a clear look at the whole thing. But the smell, did you smell it?" I pressed. He nodded slowly. "There was a smell. Bad one, like nothing I've smelled in these woods before." We stood there in silence for a moment, both of us scanning the trees around us. The forest felt oppressively quiet now, like everything was holding its breath. "Let's head back to the truck," Dad finally said, his voice unnaturally even. "I think we're done for today." We walked back together, much faster than our usual pace, frequently looking over our shoulders. Neither of us said much. I kept my rifle ready the whole time, and I noticed Dad did too, something he only does when we're tracking a wounded bear. When we got back to the truck, Dad finally broke the silence. "I've hunted these woods for 40 years, son. I've seen bears, coyotes, bobcats, hell, even a mountain lion once when they were supposed to be extinct in this area. But I've never seen anything move the way that thing did today." We drove home mostly in silence. When we got back, Dad poured himself a finger of whiskey, something he rarely does before evening, and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window for a long time. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face staring at me. I kept hearing that growl, smelling that stench. Around 3 a.m., I got up and went to the living room. Dad was already there, sitting in his recliner in the dark. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "No." "I've been thinking about what you saw today," he said carefully, "and what I saw too." "And?" He was quiet for a long moment. "There are things in these woods that people don't understand, son. My grandfather used to tell stories." He trailed off, then shook his head. "Let's just say, I believe you saw something today. Something real. We haven't talked much about it since then. I tried telling a couple of my hunting buddies, but they just laughed it off, said I probably saw a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe another hunter in heavy gear. One even suggested I might have dozed off in my stand and dreamed the whole thing, but I know what I saw. And sometimes, when Dad and I are alone and the subject of hunting comes up, I catch him looking at me with this expression that says he knows too. We still hunt those woods. We have to. It's our land, our tradition. But we never hunt alone anymore. And we never stay out past noon. I've been reading reports online about similar sightings in the Appalachian region. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch or a dozen other names. I don't know what to call it. I just know it was real, it was intelligent, and for a few terrifying moments it looked right at me with those reddish-brown eyes, like it was deciding whether to let me live. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that I can smell that distinctive stench in my bedroom, and I wonder if it remembers me too, and if our paths will ever cross again. I hope to God they don't. Story 3. I still get chills thinking about what happened that summer at the academy. It was 1991, and I was starting my second year as a cadet at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. The campus sits right against the mountains, and there's all this open wilderness around it. Beautiful place, but after what happened, I've never looked at those woods the same way. It was mid-July, a couple days before we were scheduled to head out to Jack's Valley for field training. If you've never been through military training, Jack's Valley is this rugged training area on academy grounds where they basically run us through hell for 2 weeks. Obstacle courses, combat scenarios, sleeping in tents, the works. I wasn't exactly looking forward to it, but I wasn't dreading it either. At least, not until that night. My roommate, Davis, and I were hanging out in our dorm room around 9 p.m. The sun had just gone down, and we had our window cracked open to let in some of that cool mountain air. July in Colorado can be hot during the day, but the nights cool off real nice. We were both sitting on our beds, just bullshitting about the upcoming field exercise, what to expect, who the hard-ass instructors would be this year, that kind of thing. The dorms were pretty active that night. You could hear guys laughing and talking through the walls, people walking up and down the hallways. Normal stuff. Someone was blasting Guns N' Roses from a few doors down. I remember because we were both complaining about having to hear November Rain for the 1,000th time. Then it happened. At first I thought it was someone playing a joke. There was this scream, and I'm not talking about your typical horror movie scream, or even someone yelling for help. This was, Jesus, it's hard to put into words even now. It was this high-pitched, almost inhuman sound that started as what sounded like a woman in absolute terror, and then twisted into something else entirely. It was loud enough that it seemed to come from right outside our window, but somehow also distant, like it was echoing across the entire valley. The scream went on for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 10-15 seconds. It had this quality to it that made my skin crawl, like whoever or whatever was screaming was in the worst pain imaginable or facing something absolutely terrifying. And then, the weirdest part happened. Everything went completely silent. The music stopped. The conversation stopped. The footsteps in the hallway stopped. It was like someone had hit a universal pause button on the entire campus. I've never experienced anything like it before or since. That heavy silence was almost as unnerving as the scream itself. I looked at Davis, and I could tell by his face that he'd heard it too. But instead of looking freaked out like I was, he just had this knowing look on his face. "That's the local Bigfoot," he said, so matter-of-factly that I thought he was joking. "What the hell are you talking about?" I asked him. I was still trying to process what I'd just heard, and my heart was racing like crazy. Davis wasn't the type to buy into conspiracy theories or supernatural stuff. He was a practical guy, studying aeronautical engineering, always logical. So when he started talking about Bigfoot so casually, I was caught completely off guard. "I'm serious," he said, getting up to close the window. "My friend Martinez was hiking out by Rampart Reservoir last fall and saw something. Said it was this big, hairy, human-looking thing crouched down drinking from the water." I laughed nervously. "Come on, man." "He's not the type to make shit up," Davis continued, sitting back down on his bed. "He said when it realized it was being watched, it stood up. Said it must have been at least 7 feet tall, and just walked into the forest. Didn't run, didn't seem scared, just walked away." I still thought he might be messing with me, but the dead serious look on his face was starting to make me uneasy. "So what? You think that scream was—" "They call it the Colorado Howler. Some people think it's a mountain lion. but mountain lions don't sound like that. Ask anyone who's been stationed here long enough. They've all got a story. The dorm slowly started coming back to life. We could hear people in the hallway talking in hushed voices, probably discussing what they'd just heard. The music didn't come back on, though. I tried to brush it off. "Probably just someone messing around," I said, more to convince myself than him. Davis just shrugged. Maybe, but maybe not. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little sound from outside had me on edge. I kept thinking about that scream and trying to rationalize it. Could it have been a mountain lion? A prank? Some kind of weird acoustic phenomenon? None of the explanations felt right. The next morning at breakfast, I noticed groups of cadets huddled together talking quietly. I caught fragments of conversations. "Did you hear that last night? What the hell was that?" No one seemed to have a solid explanation, but plenty had theories. I overheard an upperclassman telling some first years that it was just the usual summer wildlife and not to worry about it. But the look on his face didn't match his reassuring words. Later that day, I ran into Martinez, Davis's friend who supposedly had the Bigfoot encounter. I worked up the courage to ask him about it directly. "Hey, so Davis told me about what you saw at Rampart last year," I said, trying to sound casual. Martinez glanced around before answering, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head. "Look, I know how it sounds," he said in a low voice, "but I know what I saw. I've been hunting since I was a kid. I know every animal in these mountains. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a suit. It was something else." "And you think that's what we heard last night?" I asked. "I didn't hear anything last night," he said quickly. Too quickly. "But if it's what others are describing, yeah, maybe. Just be careful when you're out in Jack's Valley, all right? Stick with your squad, especially at night." That was not what I needed to hear the day before heading out for field training. The next day came, and we deployed to Jack's Valley for our training exercise. If you've never seen it, Jack's Valley is basically just a section of forest and open field on the academy grounds where they set up various training stations. We'd be living in tents, running combat scenarios, and basically playing soldier for 2 weeks. Under normal circumstances, I would have been focused on the training, on making sure I didn't mess up in front of the instructors, on supporting my team. But after what happened, all I could think about was that scream and what might be lurking in the trees surrounding our camp. The first day went by without incident. Standard stuff, setting up camp, orientation, running through the basic exercises. But as the sun started to set, I felt this growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. I kept scanning the tree line, expecting to see something watching us. That night, lying in my tent with 3 other cadets, I was wide awake while they all fell asleep without issue. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me tensing up. I kept thinking about what Davis had said about the Colorado howler and what Martinez had seen at the reservoir. Around 2 a.m., I needed to use the latrine. The facilities were set up about 100 yards from our tent area, which meant walking through a small stretch of trees with just a flashlight. Any other time, this would have been no big deal. Now, it felt like the longest walk of my life. I stepped outside my tent, and the night was clear and surprisingly bright with moonlight. The temperature had dropped considerably, and I could see my breath. The entire camp was silent, except for the occasional snore coming from the tents. With my flashlight pointed at the ground, I started making my way toward the latrines. Every few steps, I'd swing the beam into the surrounding darkness, half expecting to see a pair of eyes staring back at me. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I was about halfway there when I heard it. A branch breaking somewhere off to my right, deeper in the woods. I froze, shining my light in that direction. Nothing moved. I convinced myself it was probably just an animal, a deer or something equally harmless. I had just started walking again when I caught a whiff of something that stopped me in my tracks. It was this powerful, musky odor like wet dog mixed with something rotting, The smell was so strong and sudden that I actually gagged. Then I heard another branch snap, closer this time, and another. Something was moving through the trees, paralleling my path but staying just out of sight. My light wasn't powerful enough to penetrate very far into the darkness. I had two choices: run back to my tent or make a dash for the latrines, which were closer at this point. I chose the latrines, moving as fast as I could without actually breaking into a full sprint, which somehow felt like it would trigger whatever was out there to chase me. The whole time, I could hear movement keeping pace with me in the woods. Not running, just walking. Deliberate, heavy steps that didn't sound like any animal I was familiar with. I made it to the latrine building, a simple wooden structure with stalls, and practically threw myself inside. There was a single light bulb illuminating the interior with a weak yellow glow. I stood there, back against the wall, listening. For a few moments, there was nothing. Then, right outside, I heard what sounded like heavy breathing, not winded or aggressive, just the slow, deep breaths of something very large. It was right outside the thin wooden wall I was leaning against. I held my own breath, too terrified to move. The breathing continued for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then, very clearly, I heard footsteps moving away, heavy, deliberate steps that no human could make. I waited in that latrine for at least 20 minutes before I worked up the courage to peek outside. There was nothing there, at least nothing I could see. The smell was gone too. I practically ran back to my tent and didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. The next morning I was dragging from lack of sleep. During our morning exercises, I pulled Davis aside and told him what happened. "You probably just freaked yourself out," he said, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced of his own explanation. "What about the smell?" I asked. "I've never smelled anything like that before." He hesitated. "Look, Martinez told me the same thing about his encounter, said the smell was what he noticed first, like something dead had been rolling in garbage. That day, I overheard two of our instructors, both captains who'd been at the academy for years, talking in low voices when they thought none of us could hear. One of them mentioned that something had tripped the perimeter sensors on the north side of the valley during the night. The other said they'd found unusual tracks near that same area, but didn't elaborate on what made them unusual. For the rest of that field training, I never went anywhere alone, especially at night. I made sure to always have a buddy with me for latrine trips, claiming I was just being extra cautious about training protocols. I don't think anyone bought it, but no one called me out either. I never saw anything directly during those 2 weeks, but twice more I smelled that same distinctive odor. Once while we were on a night navigation exercise, and once right at the edge of our camp. Both times, the smell appeared suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. And there were other strange things. Equipment that would get moved around at night when no one was supposed to be in the supply tent. Strange vocalizations in the distance that some people claimed were just coyotes, but didn't sound like any coyotes I'd ever heard. One morning, a cadet found weird hair caught on a barbed wire fence at the edge of the training area. Thick, coarse hair that wasn't from any animal commonly found in the area. By the time we finished field training and headed back to the main campus, I was exhausted, not just from the exercises, but from the constant vigilance, the constant feeling of being watched. I never heard that blood-curdling scream again during my time at the academy, and I never saw whatever made it. But I know what I heard that night in my dorm room. I know what I smelled in those woods. And sometimes, when I dream about my time in Colorado Springs, I still hear that scream, that horrible sound that wasn't quite human, but wasn't quite animal either. The academy is full of different training scenarios designed to test you psychologically. Some part of me wonders if the whole thing was some elaborate mind game set up by our instructors. But another part of me, the part that still gets goosebumps thinking about that night, knows better. I graduated from the academy in 1993 and went on to serve for 12 years. I've been in combat zones, I've faced real dangers, but nothing has ever unsettled me quite like whatever was in those Colorado woods that summer. To this day, I avoid hiking alone, and the sound of a woman screaming, even in a movie, makes my blood run cold. I've never shared this story publicly before. Most people would probably think I imagined it or exaggerated a mountain lion encounter, but I know what I experienced, and I know I'm not the only one who's heard the Colorado howler. Story 4. I've debated posting this for years. What happened that night in '75 still gives me nightmares, and most people look at me like I'm crazy when I bring it up. I was a tribal police sergeant back then, working on the reservation. October 23rd, 1975. That date is burned into my memory forever. It started with a call from Emma Smith. Sweet old lady, 78 years old, lived alone in a small house near the western edge of the reservation. When dispatch said Emma was claiming a Bigfoot tried to break into her home, I almost laughed it off. Emma was respected in the community, not known for making up stories, but still. Bigfoot, really? I figured maybe a bear or someone trying to rob her. I drove out there around sundown. It was getting cold that time of year, probably in the low 40s, and there was already a light frost forming on the ground. Emma was waiting on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, looking terrified. Her face was ashen, and her hands were shaking when she offered me some coffee. "I'm not crazy, Ken," she said before I even asked a question. We'd known each other for years. I used to help her with firewood deliveries in winter. I know what I saw. I nodded, trying to be respectful. "Just show me what happened, Emma." She led me to the side of her house where there was a storm door leading to a mudroom. The plastic covering was completely torn, hanging in shreds. The wooden frame around it was splintered, with visible claw or hand marks, deeper than what a normal human could make. Whatever did this had incredible strength. "It was trying to get in," Emma whispered. "I heard it breathing, heavy breathing, not like a person, and it smelled awful, like wet animal and rotting meat." I examined the damage more closely. The marks were about 7 feet up the doorframe. Either someone very tall was messing with Emma, or, well, I didn't want to consider the alternative. "That's not all," Emma said, leading me to a small smokehouse about 20 yards from the main building. Several boards had been completely ripped away from one side. Inside, Emma's stored meat, mostly deer jerky and smoked fish, was gone. "It took all my winter stores," she said. "I heard it out here last night, around midnight. Made a racket, something awful. When I turned on my porch light, I saw it. Tall, covered in dark hair. Not a bear, Ken. It walked like a man, but bigger. Much bigger." I took photos and measurements of everything. The damage was real enough. Someone or something had definitely been there. I told Emma I'd increase patrols in the area and gave her my personal number to call if it came back. "It'll be back," she said with certainty. "They always come back." The "they" part bothered me, but I didn't press her. Many of our tribal elders have stories about forest creatures, things I dismissed as legends growing up. Now I wasn't so sure. I finished my report and headed back to the station. My shift was supposed to end at midnight, but I couldn't stop thinking about Emma alone out there. Around 1:30 a.m., I decided to drive back and check on her. I brought my shotgun, standard issue for animal control situations. I wasn't planning to use it, just wanted to be prepared in case it was a bear. As I approached Emma's place around 2:30 a.m., I could see flashlight beams sweeping through the trees behind her house. I parked and grabbed my shotgun and flashlight, then walked toward the commotion. There were 7 people already there: Emma, her nephew Billy, and 5 neighbors who lived within a mile or so. They all had rifles or shotguns, and they were pointing their flashlights at something in the woods about 50 yards away. "Ken, thank God," Emma said when she saw me. "It came back. It's been standing there for almost an hour. I followed their flashlight beams, and that's when I saw it. I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. Standing partially concealed in the brush was a creature about 7.5 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair or fur. It had a broad chest, massive shoulders, and a face that was almost human, but not quite. Its eyes reflected our lights like a deer or wolf, but they were set in a face with a pronounced brow ridge. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a man in a costume, it was something else entirely. My training kicked in despite my shock. "This is tribal police," I called out, raising my shotgun to my shoulder. "If that's someone in a costume, you need to identify yourself now. This is dangerous, and these people are armed." The creature didn't run. It didn't speak. It just slowly crouched lower until only its head was visible above the brush. Its eyes never left us. Intelligent, calculating eyes. "Should I shoot it, Ken?" Billy whispered, his rifle trained on the creature. "No," I said firmly. "Not unless it charges us." Truthfully, I wasn't sure if bullets would even stop this thing, and I didn't want to find out what would happen if we just wounded it. We stood in this bizarre standoff for what felt like forever. My watch showed about 20 minutes had passed when we heard movement in the brush about 30 yards to our right. Several of the flashlights swung in that direction. "There's another one!" someone hissed. Sure enough, I caught a glimpse of another hairy figure moving through the trees. This one seemed slightly smaller, but moved with the same deliberate purpose. My mouth went dry. One creature was unexplainable enough, but two, this was getting dangerous. "They're surrounding us," Emma whispered, and I could hear the others murmuring in agreement. I made a decision then. "Everyone back to the house, slow and steady. Keep your lights and weapons pointed out. Move as a group." We began backing away, never turning our backs on the creatures. The first one stood up again, now fully visible. In the combined beams of our flashlights, I could see its massive frame clearly. Its arms hung down almost to its knees, and its hands, if you could call them that, were huge, with thick fingers. We made it back to Emma's yard, but the creatures followed, keeping just at the edge of the tree line. The smaller one made a sound then, a sort of whoop that turned into a low howl. The larger one responded with a similar call. "They're communicating," I said, mostly to myself. The night grew increasingly surreal. We retreated into Emma's house and watched through the windows as the creatures circled the property, always staying just far enough away that we couldn't get a clear shot, but close enough that we could see them. They seemed to be studying us as much as we were studying them. Around 4 a.m., they finally disappeared into the deeper woods. I insisted on staying with Emma until daylight, and the others agreed to stay too. None of us slept. We just sat with our weapons ready, jumping at every sound from outside. When dawn broke around 6:30 a.m., I went outside to investigate. The ground was covered with frost, which turned out to be a blessing because it preserved the evidence perfectly. All around the property were footprints, massive, bare footprints measuring about 18 inches long and 7 inches wide. They were clearly foot-shaped with 5 toes, but no human makes prints that size. I took more photos, made plaster casts of several prints, and collected hair samples from where the creatures had pushed through thick brush. The hair was coarse and dark, not matching any known animal in our region. Word spread fast. Within days, reports started coming in from all over the reservation. People seeing tall, hairy creatures at the edges of their properties. Livestock acting strange, unusual howls in the night. In the weeks that followed, the tribal police received over 100 Bigfoot sighting reports. And me? I saw them twice more. The second time was about a week later. I was on patrol near the eastern border of the reservation, an area with dense forest and few homes. It was just after sunset, and I was driving slowly down a dirt road when my headlights caught movement ahead. I slowed to a stop and reached for my spotlight, When I switched it on, there they were, 3 of them, crossing the road about 50 yards ahead. The large one I recognized from Emma's place, plus 2 smaller ones. They stopped and looked directly at me, completely unafraid. The large one made a gesture with its arm, and the smaller ones continued into the woods. It stood there staring at me for several seconds before following them. The third encounter was the closest and most terrifying. It happened in early November, almost 2 weeks after the initial incident. I was checking on a remote hunting cabin that had reportedly been broken into. The cabin was empty, with a broken window and food supplies scattered everywhere. As I was documenting the scene, I heard heavy breathing outside. I drew my service revolver and moved to the window. Standing not 10 feet from the cabin was one of the creatures, this one different from the others I'd seen. Older maybe, with grayer hair and a scarred face. It was holding something in its hands, the remains of a deer leg it had been eating. We locked eyes through the window glass. It tilted its head, studying me with an intelligence that shook me to my core. Then it deliberately placed the deer leg on the ground in front of the cabin like an offering before backing away into the forest. I've gone over these encounters thousands of times in my mind. I've questioned my sanity, wondered if there was some explanation that makes more sense than what I saw. But the evidence was real, the footprints, the hair samples, the photographs, and I wasn't the only one who saw them. The official report I filed was heavily redacted before being made public. The hair samples and plaster casts were sent to a university for analysis, but mysteriously lost in transit. The photographs were declared inconclusive. Some of the tribal elders weren't surprised by any of this. They told me stories passed down through generations about the tall ones who lived in the deep forests, beings who weren't quite human but weren't simply animals either. They said these creatures had always been there, watching from the fringes of our world, usually wanting to be left alone, but occasionally growing curious about humans. What happened that October wasn't just a single weird night. It changed how I understand the world. I can't look at forests the same way anymore. I know there are things out there, intelligent things, that science hasn't classified or explained. Emma Smith passed away in 1983, but before she died, she told me something I've never forgotten. "They weren't trying to hurt me, Ken," she said. "They were hungry, and they knew I had food. In their own way, they were just trying to survive, same as us." I retired from the tribal police in 1992, but I still live on the reservation. Sometimes at night, especially in October when the air gets crisp, I sit on my porch and listen to the sounds of the forest. Occasionally, I hear whoops and howls that don't belong to any wolf or coyote, and I wonder if they're still out there, watching us from the shadows, these beings who share our world but remain just beyond our understanding. I've never seen them as clearly as I did that night at Emma's place, but I know what I saw, and no government redaction or scientific dismissal will ever convince me otherwise. Story 5. I've always lived in this area, same as my dad, same as his dad before him. We know every creek, holler, and patch of woods around here like most folks know their own backyards. The place we call the Old 93 Hollow has always been just another part of our regular riding routes. At least it was, until last Thursday evening. I still don't know exactly what we saw out there, but I know what I believe, and I haven't been back since. My 6-year-old boy flat out refuses to go anywhere near it now. It was just getting toward dusk last Thursday, probably between 7 and 8 p.m. Me, my wife Sarah, and our son Tyler decided to take the four-wheeler out for a ride before it got too dark. It was one of those perfect spring evenings, not too hot yet, wildflowers starting to come up in the fields. We'd been riding for about 45 minutes, just enjoying the evening air and showing Tyler some of the spots where I used to play as a kid. When we got to the hollow, I slowed down a bit. There's a big open field there that backs up to some pretty dense forest. As we rolled along the edge of it, Sarah suddenly grabbed my shoulder and pointed out toward the middle of the field. "Look, is that a bear?" she asked, and I immediately hit the brakes. About 100 yards away was what I first thought was a black bear standing on its hind legs. We get them around here sometimes, especially in spring when they're hungry after winter. I killed the engine so we could watch it without spooking it. That's when things got weird. The moment we stopped, this bear stopped too. It just stood there, completely still, watching us, and the longer I looked at it, the more I realized this was no bear. This thing was tall, way too tall. I'm 6'2", and this creature made me look like a child in comparison. It must have been at least 9 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered in dark fur from head to toe, but its proportions were all wrong for a bear. Its legs were spaced apart enough that I could see daylight between them. Its arms hung down nearly to its knees, and its shoulders... Man, its shoulders were impossibly broad. We all just froze, staring at it while it stared back at us. Tyler was sitting between Sarah and me on the four-wheeler, and I felt him start trembling. Sarah's grip on my shoulder tightened to the point of pain, but I couldn't even react. I was completely transfixed by this thing. For what must have been 2 full minutes, none of us moved. Not us, not it. It was like some bizarre standoff. I remember thinking I should start the four-wheeler and get us the hell out of there, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Curiosity, fear? I don't know. Maybe both. Then, without any warning, it started to move. It didn't run or charge at us like I half expected. Instead, it just turned and started walking across the field with this smooth, deliberate stride. Its arms swung at its sides with each step, much more like a person than any animal I've ever seen. There was something almost casual about the way it moved, like it wasn't afraid of us at all. It crossed about half the field this way, then suddenly turned toward the tree line and disappeared into the woods. The whole thing happened so fast, yet it felt like time had slowed down. As soon as it was gone, I started breathing again. I hadn't even realized I was holding my breath. Sarah was squeezing my arm so hard it left marks, and Tyler was crying silently behind me. "Daddy, what was that?" he whispered. I didn't have an answer. I still don't, but I knew we needed to get out of there, so I fired up the four-wheeler, and we headed home a lot faster than we'd come. That night, none of us slept well. Sarah and I stayed up late talking about what we'd seen. She described exactly what I saw. This massive, furry humanoid figure that moved with an unnerving purpose. We both knew bears. We both knew every animal that's supposed to be in these woods. This wasn't any of them. The next morning, I called my younger brother Mike and told him what happened. He's always been the skeptical one in the family, but something in my voice must have convinced him this was serious. He said he and our Uncle Bill would check it out. I warned him to be careful, but part of me was relieved they were going. I needed someone else to see this thing, to validate what we'd experienced. They headed out to the hollow around the same time we'd been there the previous day. When they came back 3 hours later, Mike looked pale. Uncle Bill, who's hunted these woods for over 50 years and isn't scared of anything, seemed shaken. They saw it, in the exact same spot we did. According to Mike, they were driving slowly along the edge of the field when they spotted something crossing the road about 70 yards ahead of them. It then moved along the field's edge, before disappearing into the same section of woods our creature had entered. Uncle Bill had brought his binoculars and got a better look than we did. He described it as looking like a pro basketball player, but much more muscular, completely covered in fur from head to toe. He estimated it was somewhere between 8 and 10 feet tall. Mike said what struck him most was how it moved, not like any animal he'd ever seen, but with a deliberate, almost human gait. So now 4 people had seen this thing in the same location on 2 consecutive days. That night, Sarah and I researched online about similar sightings in our area. There were surprisingly many, mostly dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but the descriptions matched what we saw almost perfectly. Most people called it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I'd always laughed at those stories before. I'm not laughing anymore. By Saturday, I'd convinced myself that I needed to go back. Not because I wanted to see that thing again, God knows I didn't, but because I had to understand what was happening in our woods. Sarah reluctantly agreed to come with me, but we both insisted Tyler stay at my mom's house. He was more than happy to oblige. I'm never going back to that hollow again, he told us, and I couldn't blame him. We decided to go in the morning this time, thinking maybe this creature was mainly active in the evening. Sarah suggested we look for mushrooms as a cover. Morels would be coming up, and that area always had good hunting. In reality, we both knew we were looking for signs of whatever we'd seen. We arrived at the hollow around 10 a.m. It felt different in the daylight, less menacing, more familiar. But there was still an undercurrent of tension as we parked the four-wheeler at the edge of the field and began scanning the tree line. For about 30 minutes, everything seemed normal. We found a few early morels popping up, and the woods were alive with the usual spring sounds, birds singing, squirrels chattering. I was just starting to think maybe we'd imagined the whole thing when we heard it. A loud, deliberate knocking sound came from the woods to our left, the same woods where the creature had disappeared. It wasn't random, like a falling branch. It was rhythmic, almost like someone taking a baseball bat to a tree. Knock, knock, knock. Sarah and I froze, staring at each other. Before either of us could speak, another sound started up from the opposite direction. From an old abandoned house about 200 yards to our right came this high-pitched screaming noise, almost like a hunting dog, but wrong somehow. More sustained and deliberate. The knocking from the woods got louder and more frequent. The screaming from the house matched it, building in intensity. It was like they were communicating, calling back and forth to each other. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, but curiosity got the better of me. "Let me just check it out first," I said, moving toward the four-wheeler. I started the engine, thinking I'd drive over toward the old house to see what was making that sound. The moment the engine roared to life, both the knocking and screaming immediately intensified. It was like my starting the four-wheeler had triggered something. Then I heard crashing in the woods, heavy movement, branches breaking. Whatever was making the knocking sound was now moving, and it was moving fast, towards Sarah. "Get on!" I yelled over the engine and screaming. Sarah didn't hesitate. She sprinted to the four-wheeler and jumped on behind me. As we sped away, I glanced back toward the woods. I didn't see anything emerge, but the crashing sounds were getting closer to where we'd been standing. The screaming from the house continued until we were well out of the hollow. We didn't stop until we reached the main road. Sarah was clutching me so tight I could feel her trembling. When we finally stopped and she let go, her hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Did you see anything?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, but something was coming. Something big. That was 2 days ago. I haven't been back to the hollow since, and I don't plan to." Uncle Bill went out with a hunting buddy yesterday to check the area in broad daylight. They found massive footprints near where we heard the crashing, 18 inches long at least, with 5 distinct toes. They also found broken branches high up on trees, much higher than a person could reach. Tyler won't even talk about it. When I tried to bring it up, he started crying and said, "I'm never going there again, Daddy. Never, ever." Something about the way he said it, with such complete conviction, chilled me to the bone. I don't know what's out there in the old 93 hollow. I don't know if it's what people call Bigfoot or something else entirely. But I know what my family saw, and I know what we heard. There's something in those woods that shouldn't be there, something that watches and waits and communicates in ways we don't understand. I've lived here all my life, but there are parts of these woods I don't think are meant for us to know. The hollow is one of them, and for now at least, I'm content to leave it that way. Story 6. I never believed in this stuff before, never even gave it a second thought. I'm just a regular guy who works construction in South Jersey, likes fishing on weekends, and minds my own business. But what happened last summer changed everything for me, and I still can't make sense of it. It was Thursday, June 20th, just last year. I had the day off and decided to check out this trail in the pine barrens I'd heard about. The weather was perfect, warm but not too hot, maybe mid-70s with some clouds rolling in. The forecast mentioned storms later, but I figured I had plenty of time for a quick hike before anything hit. I was driving south on Route 563, just past Chatsworth. If you know the area, it's pretty remote. Just dense pine forest, scrubby vegetation and swampy patches for miles. I was trying to find the speedwell entrance to Franklin Parker Preserve around 6:40 in the evening. The sun was still up, but starting to get lower, casting these long shadows across the road. I was driving slowly, maybe 35 mid-Chi, scanning for the parking area, when something caught my eye on the left side of the road. At first glance, I thought it was a groundhog, a really big one. We get them around here all the time, but something about this one seemed off. It was too large, and the color wasn't right. I slowed down to get a better look, and that's when it happened. The groundhog stood up on two legs. I'm not making this up. I literally watched this thing go, from being on all fours to standing upright like a person. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't a groundhog. It wasn't a bear cub. It wasn't anything I recognized. I drove past it, my eyes locked on my rearview mirror, watching this creature standing there. I was about 150 yards down the road when I decided to turn around. I know that sounds crazy. Most people would have floored it out of there, but I had to be sure of what I saw. I just had to know. I pulled a U-turn and slowly drove back to the spot. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and my heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I half expected it to be gone, like maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, but it was still there, standing in the same spot, but now fully facing me. I stopped the car about 30 yards away. We just stared at each other. This is where it gets weird, and I know how this sounds, but I swear on everything I care about that what I'm about to describe is exactly what I saw. It looked like some bizarre mix between a monkey and a small person. If you remember that old show, Land of the Lost, it reminded me of Chaka from that. Or maybe like Curious George, if he were real and not a cartoon. But even those comparisons don't quite capture it. It stood about 4 feet tall. I'm certain of this, because later I measured against the trees and brush where it had been standing. Its body was covered in this golden brown fur, maybe 3-4 inches long. But its face, hands and feet were bare skin, a light tan color almost like caramel. The face is what really got me. It had these huge dark brown eyes, like completely dark with no whites visible, and they were fixed right on me. The nose was flat and wide, and its mouth was closed, so I couldn't see if it had teeth. Its head seemed proportionally larger than a human child's would be, with that same golden-brown fur covering it except for the face. The whole time, it never made a sound, not a single noise. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 to 10 seconds. Then, without warning, it bolted. I've never seen anything move that fast. It didn't run like a person or even like a bear. It was this fluid, almost graceful motion as it took off toward the swampy area on the left side of the road. Its arms swung in a way that seemed both human and not. It disappeared behind some bushes about 20 yards from the road's edge. I sat there in my car, completely frozen. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Was it a kid in a costume? No way. The movement was too natural, too fluid. A bear cub? Definitely not. Bears don't stand like that, and the proportions were all wrong. Some kind of escaped exotic pet? Maybe, but it seemed unlikely in rural New Jersey. The rational part of my brain kept trying to come up with explanations, but I knew what I'd seen. It was a juvenile Sasquatch. I know how that sounds, believe me. If someone had told me this story a day earlier, I would have laughed in their face. But there I was, sitting in my car, trying to process the fact that I'd just locked eyes with a creature that's not supposed to exist. After a few minutes, I finally got the courage to get out of my car. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I wanted to look for footprints or some other evidence. The air felt heavy, like it does before a storm. In the distance, I could hear the faint rumble of thunder. I walked to the spot where the creature had been standing. The ground was covered in pine needles and sandy soil. I couldn't make out any clear footprints, but there was a small area where the needles seemed disturbed, pushed aside like something had been standing there. I looked toward where it had disappeared. The vegetation got thick fast, a mix of scrubby pines, blueberry bushes, and swampy undergrowth. I took a few steps in that direction, but stopped. The sun was getting lower, storm clouds were rolling in, and I suddenly felt very exposed and very alone. That's when the first raindrops hit, big, heavy drops that promised a downpour. I hurried back to my car just as the sky opened up. The rain came down in sheets, pounding on my roof as lightning flashed across the darkening sky. I sat there for about 20 minutes, the rain too heavy to drive safely. My mind kept replaying what I'd seen. The way it stood up, the eyes, the way it moved. I kept trying to convince myself it was something else, anything else. But I knew what I'd seen. When the rain let up a bit, I decided to head home. I didn't even look for the trailhead anymore. I just wanted to get back to something normal and familiar. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't tell anyone at first. How could I? Hey, guess what I saw on my way to hike in the Pine Barrens? A baby Bigfoot. Yeah, right, they'd think I was crazy or making it up for attention. But after about a week of this eating away at me, I started searching online. That's when I found the BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. I was skeptical at first, thinking it would be a bunch of conspiracy theorists, but they seemed more professional than I expected. They had a form for reporting sightings, so after a lot of hesitation, I filled it out. I used just my first name, Mike, and provided my email, but not my phone number. Part of me still couldn't believe I was doing this. A few days later, I got an email from a guy named Eric Spinner, who said he was a BFRO investigator for New Jersey. He wanted to talk about my sighting. We set up a call and I walked him through everything I've just described. I expected skepticism or for him to tell me I was mistaken, but he took me seriously. He asked detailed questions about the creature's proportions, its movements, the exact location, the time of day, the weather conditions. He seemed particularly interested in the fact that its fur had looked dry even though storms were moving in, though somewhat matted like it had been wet before. Eric asked if I'd be willing to meet him at the location to show him exactly where it happened. After some thought, I agreed. What did I have to lose? The following weekend, I met Eric and two other investigators at a small diner near Chatsworth. They were normal-looking guys, not the wild-eyed conspiracy theorists I half expected. Eric was in his 50s, soft-spoken but confident. The others were Tom and Ray, both middle-aged guys who had been investigating Bigfoot reports for years. We drove in separate cars to the spot on Route 563. Standing there in broad daylight, it felt almost silly. How could something like this happen on this ordinary stretch of road? But as I pointed out exactly where I'd seen the creature, where it had run to, the whole experience came flooding back. Eric had me stand where the creature had been while Tom took measurements and photos. They determined that if what I saw was about 4 feet tall, it would have had shoulders about 18 inches wide. I described again how its arms seemed thin, almost lanky, with an undeveloped chest but more muscular legs, like a kid who hasn't filled out yet. What surprised me was when Eric said this wasn't the first report from this area. He'd been here before investigating other sightings and had even recorded wood knocks, whatever those are, and found juvenile tracks in the soft ground near the bogs. He explained that this whole area used to be cranberry bogs and is now preserved for recreation, with lots of lakes and streams running through it. Perfect habitat, apparently. The Pine Barrens has a long history of strange sightings, Eric told me, Most people associate it with the Jersey Devil, but there have been consistent Bigfoot reports here for decades. They just don't get the same attention. He showed me a plaster cast of what he said was a juvenile Sasquatch print found about 2 miles from where I had my sighting. It was about 8 inches long, with 5 clear toes, not like a bear print at all. It looked disturbingly human-like, just broader and with different proportions. We spent a couple of hours out there, with me recounting every detail I could remember and them taking notes, measurements, and photos. They even had some kind of thermal imaging camera they used to scan the tree line, though nothing showed up. Before we left, Eric said something that still sticks with me. Most people go their whole lives in these woods and never see what you saw. Either you got incredibly lucky or it wanted you to see it. That thought, that it might have wanted me to see it, gives me chills even now. It's been over a year since that day, and I still drive down that road sometimes, always slowing down at that spot. I've never seen anything like it again, and part of me hopes I never do. But another part keeps looking, keeps wondering. I don't talk about this much. A few close friends know, and they give me this look, like they're not sure whether to believe me or worry about my mental health. I get it. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Sometimes I wonder if I really saw what I think I saw. Maybe it was just a weird trick of the light, or some kind of animal I'm not familiar with. But then I remember those eyes looking right at me, intelligent and aware, and I know what I saw. The pine barrens feel different to me now. When I go fishing or hiking, I'm always aware that I might not be alone out there. I listen differently. I watch the trees and brush more carefully. I've started bringing a camera everywhere, just in case. I don't know if I'll ever see another one or if anyone will believe my story, but I know what happened that evening in June. Something shared the woods with me, something that most people don't believe exists. And sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's out there right now, watching and waiting, just beyond the edge of the light. Story 7. I've spent 2 weeks trying to figure out how to write this down. I'm still shaking when I think about it. I've always been the guy who needs proof for everything. The skeptic who laughs at those "I saw Bigfoot" videos on YouTube. Well, I'm not laughing anymore. March 18th, 2010. That date is burned into my memory forever. I was out in the Pine Barrens with my friend Melissa, doing some night research. I've been a BFRO investigator for about 3 years now. That's Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, for those who don't know. And while I've heard countless stories and followed up on dozens of leads, I'd never had a personal encounter. That night started out like any other investigation. We'd spent hours wandering through the quiet darkness of the Barrens, listening for unusual sounds, looking for signs, broken branches, prints, anything out of the ordinary. Nothing. Just the usual chorus of spring peepers and the occasional owl. By midnight, we were beat and decided to pack it in. The Pine Barrens in New Jersey are massive. Over 1 million acres of dense forest, wetlands, and sandy soil. People don't realize how wild it still is out there. You can drive for miles without seeing another car, especially on weeknights. Melissa was half asleep in the passenger seat as I drove us back toward civilization. It was around 12:35 a.m., and I remember checking the time because I was worried about getting her home late. The road was empty, a narrow 2-lane blacktop cutting through the dense pine forest. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, and I was going about 50 mph, not speeding but moving right along. We were chatting about the lack of activity, maybe planning our next outing. The radio was playing softly, something forgettable. That's when it happened. Something exploded from the tree line on the right side of the road, and I mean exploded, like it had been shot out of a cannon. My brain didn't even have time to process what I was seeing before I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, the tires squealing against the asphalt. I felt the anti-lock brakes pulsing under my foot. "Holy shit!" I yelled. Melissa screamed and grabbed the dashboard. For a split second, and I mean literally a fraction of a second, my headlights illuminated something tall, something that wasn't supposed to exist. My first thought was deer, because that's what you expect on these roads at night. But this was no deer. Then my mind flipped to bear. But no, bears don't run like that. A person in a costume at 12:30 a.m. in the middle of nowhere? No way. What I saw was a massive figure, hunched at the shoulders but still taller than my Honda Accord. It was running across the road, pumping its arms like a sprinter. The way it moved was wrong. Too fluid for something that big. Too fast. Way too fast. As my car screeched to a halt, the thing was directly in front of us, caught in the full beam of my headlights. And then it did something I'll never forget. It turned its upper body toward us, just its torso, while its legs kept moving. The face, I can't really describe it properly. It was like a primitive human face, but not human at all. Wide-set eyes that reflected my headlights, a broad, flat nose, no chin to speak of, and the expression, Jesus, the expression. It looked shocked, startled, like it had made a mistake and knew it. Then it was gone, vanishing into the woods on the left side of the road. The whole encounter lasted maybe 3 seconds. The car hadn't even come to a complete stop before it disappeared into the darkness. Melissa and I sat there in stunned silence, the only sound our ragged breathing and the engine idling. I looked at her, and her face was completely drained of color. "Did you—" I couldn't even finish the sentence. "What the hell was that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "What the hell was that?" I put the car in park and grabbed the flashlight from my glove compartment. My training kicked in. I needed to check for evidence while it was fresh. "Stay here," I told Melissa, but she was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "No way I'm staying alone in this car," she said. I made a U-turn and pulled over to the shoulder near where the creature had emerged. With shaking hands, I turned on my flashlight and stepped out of the car. The night was eerily quiet now. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. Just the soft tick of my cooling engine and our footsteps on the asphalt. "Listen," I whispered, raising my hand. We stood perfectly still. Nothing. No breaking branches, no heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. Whatever it was, it moved silently despite its size. I swept my flashlight along the side of the road, looking for tracks or broken vegetation. There wasn't much to see. The ground was hard-packed dirt and gravel at the edge of the pavement. No clear footprints. I noticed there was a trail leading into the woods on the right side, lined with a chain-link fence. Beyond that, I could make out the silhouettes of high-tension electrical towers stretching into the distance. "Eric." Melissa's voice was tense. She was pointing across the road. About 50 yards ahead lay the carcass of a deer, obviously hit by a car earlier. It was splayed half on the road, half on the shoulder. Had the creature been heading for it? Was it attracted by the smell of carrion? I took a few tentative steps toward the woods where it had disappeared, but stopped. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to go in there, not to follow it into the darkness. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something feels wrong, and this felt very, very wrong. We stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, listening, looking for any sign. I even sniffed the air, trying to detect the musky odor witnesses often report, but there was nothing unusual, just the smell of pines and the faint metallic scent of the upcoming rain. Finally, we got back in the car. I locked the doors immediately. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. My hands were still shaking on the steering wheel. "You know what we saw, right?" Melissa finally said. I nodded. I didn't want to say it out loud, like naming it would somehow make it more real. But there was no doubt in my mind. After years of interviewing witnesses, analyzing reports, looking at blurry photos and questionable videos, I had finally seen one with my own eyes. A Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. I can already hear the skepticism. Trust me, no one was more skeptical than I was before that night. But when you see something like that with your own eyes, something that doesn't fit into any category your brain has created, it changes you. Here's what I remember most clearly. It was huge. Even hunched over as it ran, its shoulders were a good 2.5 to 3 feet above my car hood. It had reddish-brown hair, not super long but flowing as it moved, maybe 3 or 4 inches in length. Its legs were thick like tree trunks, but it moved with an athlete's grace. The speed was what got me the most. Something that size shouldn't be able to move that fast. It crossed the entire width of the road in what felt like a single bound. I've spent the last 11 years trying to make sense of what happened that night. I've gone back to that spot dozens of times, in daylight and at night. I've interviewed locals, checked police reports for unusual animal sightings, looked for patterns. In the year after our encounter, I documented 2 other sightings in the same general area, both describing a large, hair-covered bipedal creature crossing roads at night. The most logical explanation I can come up with is that we caught a glimpse of a creature using that utility line corridor as a travel route. It's common knowledge among wildlife researchers that animals often use these man-made clearings as paths of least resistance through dense forest. The deer carcass might have been its destination, or maybe it was just crossing from one section of forest to another. What haunts me most is the look on its face when it realized we had seen it. That moment of recognition, of awareness. Whatever this creature is, it knows we exist, and it goes to great lengths to avoid us. I still investigate reports for the BFRO. I still go out into the woods at night, but now I do it with a different perspective. I'm no longer looking to prove anything to myself. I know what I saw. Now I'm trying to understand. How has something this large remained hidden for so long? How many of them are there? How intelligent are they? Melissa refuses to go back to the Pine Barrens. She won't even talk about what happened anymore. I get it. Some people can incorporate these experiences into their worldview. Others need to lock them away to maintain their sanity. Every time I drive that stretch of road now, I slow down. I scan the tree line on both sides. Part of me hopes to see it again, to confirm that I didn't imagine the whole thing. But another part of me, a primal part at the base of my brain, hopes I never encounter it again. Because when you look into the eyes of something that isn't supposed to exist, something that has successfully avoided scientific documentation for centuries, despite our best efforts to find it, you have to ask yourself, is it hiding from us? Or are we the ones being watched? I don't have answers, just questions, and the memory of those 3 seconds that changed everything I thought I knew about the world. All I can tell you is what I saw that night on that empty road in the Pine Barrens. You can believe me or not, I've stopped trying to convince people. But if you find yourself driving through there late at night, pay attention. Watch the shadows at the edge of your headlights. Listen for unusual silence in the woods. And whatever you do, drive carefully. You never know what might be crossing the road ahead. Story 8. I've held this inside for so long that it feels strange to finally type it out. I guess I need to get it off my chest, even anonymously. Maybe someone else has seen what I saw. I was only 10 years old when it happened, back in the early 80s in Troup County, Georgia. My grandfather owned this big 98-acre farm that I absolutely loved visiting. He had cattle, some hogs, chickens, and grew all sorts of crops. The watermelon patch was my favorite. Nothing beat eating fresh-picked watermelon on a hot summer day. I'd help Grandpa with chores every day I was there, feeding animals, helping collect eggs, and whatever else needed doing. But the best part was always after the work was done, when I could explore. The property had this amazing creek running through it and a good-sized swamp, about 10 acres or so, created by beaver dams. I'd spend hours out there catching frogs, looking for arrowheads, and just being a kid. This happened in winter, though. It was late afternoon, maybe around 4:30 or 5, and the sun was already getting low. The air had that crisp winter chill that makes your nose run and your breath visible. I remember wearing my favorite jacket, this red and black flannel-lined one my mum had gotten me for Christmas, and some old jeans. I'd been down by the creek for a while, but knew I needed to head back before it got dark. The path I took was this worn dirt trail that snaked through some woods before opening up to the fields closer to the farmhouse. I knew that trail like the back of my hand, every root, every turn. I was walking along, kicking at rocks, thinking about what Grandma might be making for dinner. Hopefully her fried chicken. That's when I felt it, this weird feeling on the back of my neck. You know that sensation when you just know someone's watching you? It was like that, but worse. The birds had gone quiet too, which I hadn't noticed until that moment. I slowed down and turned around to look behind me, half expecting to see one of the farm dogs following me, or maybe a deer watching from the trees. What I saw instead will never leave my memory as long as I live. About 80 yards back, partially obscured by some winter bare trees but clearly visible, was something, someone, something. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall and covered in this light brown, almost tan-colored hair that hung in tangles all over its body. It was standing perfectly still, just watching me. I froze completely. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't a bear. We didn't have bears around there, and anyway, this thing was standing on 2 legs. It wasn't a person in a costume. We were miles from anywhere, on private property, and no human could be that big. The thing that struck me most were its eyes. Even from that distance I could see they were yellowish, not like human eyes at all. They were fixed right on me, unblinking. Its arms hung down at its sides, way longer than a person's arm should be, almost to its knees. The hands looked wrong too, bigger than they should be, with these long fingers that reminded me of claws. I don't know how long we stared at each other, maybe 5 seconds, maybe 30. Time felt broken. What went through my mind was pure panic, but also this weird calculation. I was about a 1/4 mile from the farmhouse. I knew I couldn't outrun this thing. Its legs were so long, and I was just a skinny kid. But I also knew I couldn't just stand there forever. When I finally moved, it was pure instinct. I turned and ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life. My lungs burned immediately in the cold air, but I didn't care. I just needed to get home. I remember pumping my arms, my feet pounding on the dirt path, then later crunching through the frost-covered field grass. I kept waiting to hear footsteps behind me, kept expecting at any second to feel a hand grab my shoulder or the back of my jacket. There was this wooden fence between the field and the yard. I hit it at full speed and vaulted over it without even slowing down, something I'd never been able to do before. I sprinted the final stretch to the back porch and burst through the door, slamming it behind me. Grandpa was at the kitchen table drinking coffee. He looked up, startled, as I stood there gasping for breath, unable to speak. My face must have been ghost white. "What's got into you, boy?" he asked. "Looks like you seen the devil himself." I couldn't tell him. I just couldn't. Instead, I mumbled something about being chased by a dog from the neighbor's property. He seemed skeptical but didn't push it. Grandma just brought me some hot chocolate and told me to settle down. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the old farmhouse had me wide-eyed, staring at the window, terrified I'd see those yellow eyes looking back at me. I never went back to the swamp or creek alone after that. When Grandpa asked me to help him check fencing near there, I'd make up excuses or insist we go together. I think he found it odd how my favorite exploring spots suddenly held no interest for me, but he never questioned it much. The thing is, after that day, I started noticing other strange things I'd overlooked before, like how sometimes the cattle would be spooked for no reason, especially the ones grazing closest to the swamp, or how occasionally we'd find a calf that had been killed and, well, torn apart isn't the right word. It was more methodical than that, like it had been dissected. Grandpa always blamed coyotes or maybe a mountain lion, though no one had seen a mountain lion in the county for decades. The neighboring farm had lost some goats the same way. I kept my experience secret for years, through middle school, high school, college. I never told anyone. Part of me worried people would think I was crazy or making it up for attention. Another part of me worried that talking about it would somehow make it more real, would cement that day as something that actually happened rather than some weird childhood hallucination. It wasn't until I was in my 30s, married with a kid of my own, that I finally told my wife. We'd been watching some TV show about unexplained phenomena, and they mentioned Bigfoot sightings. She made some joking comment, and something in me just broke. I told her everything, expecting her to laugh. She didn't laugh. She just held my hand and listened. After that, it became easier to talk about. I told my parents. I told one close friend who was into cryptozoology, but that was it. I never made a report or went public with it. Grandpa passed away when I was in my mid-30s. The farm went to my mother, who kept it but didn't live there. She'd rent out the fields to local farmers, but kept the house as a family getaway spot. About 5 years after Grandpa died, something happened that made my blood run cold. A friend of my uncle's, an experienced hunter who'd been hunting deer on our property for years, came back to the house visibly shaken. He told my uncle he'd heard something while in his stand near the swamp. A sound he couldn't explain, like a howl but not quite. Like a scream, but wrong somehow. Said in 30 years of hunting, he'd never heard anything like it. He packed up and left right after telling my uncle, and never came back to hunt our land again. When my uncle told me this story, all I could think was, it's still there. The area is still pretty remote. The nearest neighbor is over a mile away, and there's plenty of food. Deer, wild hogs, small mammals, nuts, wild grapes in season, and water year-round from the creek and swamp. Perfect habitat, I guess. I'm retired now, living a few states away. I've never gone back to look for it, never tried to prove what I saw. Some things you just know in your gut, evidence or not. What I saw that winter afternoon was real. It was a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. It was watching me with intelligence in those yellow eyes. I don't know if it meant me harm or was just curious about the kid who kept invading its territory. But I do know this. I wasn't the first person to see one of these creatures, and I won't be the last. They're out there, in the remote corners where most people don't go. Sometimes I wonder if that's why I saw it. Because I was just a kid who hadn't learned yet to dismiss the impossible. I still have dreams about those eyes sometimes. Dreams where I don't run away, where instead I stand my ground and the creature approaches. I always wake up before I can see what happens next. What bothers me most, even now, is wondering, was it just passing through, or had it been watching me all those days I played alone by the creek, thinking I was the only one there? Story 9. I still can't sleep right when I think about what happened at that cabin. Even now, typing this out from my apartment with all the lights on, I get this feeling like something's watching from outside my window. It's been over 10 years since it started, and I still haven't found any explanation that makes sense. It was late fall 2010, right around Thanksgiving. My buddy Alan had access to his family's cabin near the Alapaha River, east of Tifton, Georgia. The place was seriously remote, like a mile from the nearest actual house, surrounded by thick woods and planted pines. The cabin sat on this curve in the river. Pretty spot that would have been peaceful if I'd known then what I know now. We planned a weekend getaway with some friends from college. Nothing fancy, just fishing, drinking beers, grilling and hanging out. Alan and I arrived first on Friday afternoon to get the place ready. The others were coming later that night. Around 11 p.m., Alan and I drove back to the entrance gate to let in the first car of friends. The gate was about a quarter mile from the cabin, down this dark dirt road with thick woods on both sides. We unlocked it and were just standing there bullshitting while waiting for headlights to appear. That's when Alan suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He grabbed my arm and whispered, "Did you hear that?" I hadn't heard anything, but Alan's face had gone completely white. He was staring into the woods to our right, his eyes wide. "What?" I asked, starting to feel uneasy. Something just made this sound. He was struggling to describe it. Like a deep grunt, really deep, right over there. He pointed to a spot maybe 30 yards into the dark trees. I didn't hear anything, and our friends pulled up a minute later. We brushed it off as probably a feral hog or something. Georgia's full of them. About an hour later, we headed back to open the gate for the last car. This time, while we were standing there waiting, I heard it. It's hard to describe accurately, but it was this deep, guttural grunt that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard, not a hog, not a bear. It was almost like someone had dropped a bass drum from 10 feet up. It came from the same area Alan had pointed to earlier. We both heard it this time. Neither of us said anything, but we both knew. When our friends arrived, we hurried them through the gate, locked it behind us, and got the hell back to the cabin. The rest of the night was normal. We grilled, had some beers, caught up. Around 2 a.m. most people were getting tired, but a few of us were still wired. Me, my friend Casey, and Alan's cousin Mike decided to walk down to the dock. The cabin had this wooden dock that extended maybe 30 feet into the river. It was a clear night with a half moon, so we could see pretty well. We sat at the end of the dock, drinking and talking. The dock had this little light on a post that illuminated about 20 feet around us. But beyond that was just darkness. The river was maybe 40 yards wide at that point. The opposite bank was a mix of sandy shore and thick trees. I was absently picking up little pieces of gravel from the dock and tossing them into the water. Just something to do with my hands while we talked. After a few minutes, I noticed something weird. Every time I'd toss a rock and it would splash, there'd be another splash a few seconds later, downstream a bit. At first, I thought it was just fish jumping, but then I realized the timing was too perfect. Every single time I threw something in, there'd be an answering splash. I stopped talking and focused on this. I threw another piece of gravel. Splash. Then about 3 seconds later, splash again from downstream. I nudged Casey. "Watch this," I said. I tossed another rock. Splash, and sure enough, splash again downstream. All three of us went quiet. I stared across the water, and that's when I saw it. On the opposite bank, partially hidden beside a tall pine tree, was a dark figure. It was just beyond where our dock light reached, but I could make out its silhouette against the lighter background of sand. It was tall, really tall. If that was a person, they had to be at least 7 feet. But the proportions were all wrong. The arms seemed too long, hanging down past where knees would be. "Do you guys see that?" I whispered, nodding toward the figure. They both turned to look. Casey sucked in a breath. "What the fuck is that?" Mike whispered. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, partially hidden by the tree, watching us. I grabbed more gravel and threw it, but not into the water this time. I threw it toward the left bank, away from the figure. The rocks scattered across the sandy shore. The figure didn't react. It stayed perfectly still. Then, about 10 seconds later, we heard the biggest splash yet. It sounded like someone had thrown a boulder into the water downstream from us. It was loud enough that water actually sloshed against the dock posts. "We need to go back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. No one argued. We got up and walked, didn't run, but walked very quickly back to the cabin. We turned on every outside light and locked all the doors and windows. Nobody mentioned what we'd seen, but none of us slept well that night. The next morning in the daylight, it was easier to dismiss what happened. We convinced ourselves it was probably just some local messing with us, or maybe a deer or something that looked bigger in the dark. But later that day, Alan and I were alone for a bit, and he brought up something I hadn't known. When he was a kid, his family had a Rottweiler at that same cabin. One night, something attacked and killed the dog. They found it the next morning with its neck broken. Whatever did it had to be incredibly strong. A Rottweiler isn't exactly easy to kill. And then Alan told me about his grandmother. Back in the 60s, she claimed she was chased by something near their house, something tall and black with red eyes. She described it as walking on two legs, but running faster than any person could. His father and uncle had seen something too, back in the 70s, while night fishing on the river. They described it as looking like a Sasquatch. I'd always been skeptical about that kind of stuff, but after what I'd seen and heard, I wasn't so sure anymore. We didn't tell the others about these stories. We didn't want to spook everyone. The rest of the weekend went fine, and we headed home on Sunday without any more incidents. Over the next few months I did some research. I found recordings online of what people claimed were Sasquatch vocalizations. When I played them for Alan, he went pale again. He said that's exactly what he heard that night at the gate, the same type of grunt. In October 2012, about 2 years later, a smaller group of us went back to the cabin. Part of me was hoping to experience something again, to confirm I hadn't imagined it. Part of me was terrified we would. It was a similar setup. We arrived in the afternoon, grilled dinner, had some drinks. This time, it was just 4 of us. Me, Alan, Casey, and Alan's brother Josh. After dark, we decided to go down to the dock again. We brought a cooler of beer and a portable speaker to play music. We were telling stories, laughing, having a good time. Then I noticed something. The forest had gone completely silent. No frogs, no crickets, no nightbirds, nothing. In the Georgia woods at night, that's not normal. There's always noise. Then we heard it, a howl from somewhere in the forest behind the cabin. It started like a wolf howl, but it changed halfway through into something else, something that didn't sound like any animal I know. A few minutes later, we heard what sounded like turkey calls. But it was the middle of the night. Turkeys don't call at night. And just like the howl, the turkey sounds morphed into something else. Something that sounded more like a primate. There was a neighboring cabin about 200 yards away through the woods. Nobody was staying there, but it had motion detector lights on the outside. Suddenly, those lights came on. Something had triggered them. The neighbor had a small chicken coop, and immediately after the lights came on, we could hear the chickens going crazy, squawking and flapping around like something was after them. We sat frozen on the dock, listening. It felt like something was circling us, moving through the pine forest around the cabin. We'd hear a branch snap on one side, then a few minutes later, another sound from a completely different direction. Casey wanted to leave that night. Just pack up and drive the 3 hours back to Atlanta. But it was already past midnight, and none of us wanted to walk back through those woods to the cars in the dark. We made it through the night, all sleeping in the main room rather than splitting up into different bedrooms. We left first thing in the morning, and I haven't been back to that cabin since. I've spent years trying to explain what happened. Could it have been other people messing with us? Maybe, but who would go to such elaborate lengths? Making those sounds, standing in the river at night. And why? The cabin was so remote, it's not like random people would even know we were there. Could it have been known wildlife? I've lived in Georgia my whole life. I know what bears sound like, what coyotes and bobcats sound like. This wasn't that. I don't know what was out there those nights, but I'm convinced that whatever watched us from across the river that first night wasn't human, and I believe there were multiple of them during that second trip, coordinating, mimicking other animals, circling our position. Some people I've told think it was Sasquatch. Maybe it was. All I know is that I used to love camping, fishing, being outdoors. Now I get anxious just walking my dog after dark in a well-lit suburban park. Those experiences changed something fundamental in me. They took away the comfort and safety I used to feel in nature. I still have nightmares about that dark figure across the river. In the dreams, it's always moving toward me, crossing the water, and I can never run fast enough to escape it. I wake up with that same feeling I had on the dock, like something ancient and predatory has fixed its attention on me, and there's nowhere to hide. Whatever was at Alapaha River that night, I hope I never encounter it again. Story 10. I've never really told this story to many people outside my family. It's been over 40 years now, but I still get this weird feeling in my stomach whenever I think about what happened that day in the summer of '77. I was 10 years old, and looking back, it changed everything about how I see the woods, the dark, and what might be out there watching us. We lived in a small trailer on my family's property in Morrow County, Ohio. Nothing fancy, just a double wide surrounded by about 15 acres of woods. Back then, kids actually played outside all day long. No phones, no video games, just exploring and making up adventures. That particular morning in July, I was with my little brother Tommy, he was 7, and our cousin Mark, 12. Our parents let us roam pretty freely on the property, as long as we stayed within the boundaries my dad had shown us. The woods weren't super dense, mostly oak and maple with some pines scattered throughout. There were little streams and rocky outcroppings that made for great hideouts and forts. It was around 10 in the morning, clear skies, sun filtering through the trees. Not too hot yet. We were following this little game trail that cut through our property, looking for frogs or anything interesting. Tommy had this bug catcher thing our grandma got him, and he was determined to find something cool to show Mom. We'd been out for maybe an hour, and I remember I was wearing these red canvas sneakers my mom had bought at Kmart. They were already covered in mud from crossing a small creek earlier. I only mention that because I remember staring at my shoes when it happened, almost like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing just off to the right. It was just movement at first. When you spend time in the woods, you get used to seeing squirrels or deer moving around in your peripheral vision. But this was different, bigger, more deliberate. I stopped walking, and Tommy bumped into me from behind. I turned my head slowly to look, and about 40 yards away, partially behind a thick oak tree, was something I couldn't explain. My first thought was actually, that's a person in a costume. But even as a kid, I knew that made no sense out here on our property. It was I don't even know what to call it. A creature, a Sasquatch. It was huge. I'd guess around 7'5" tall. It had this reddish-brown hair covering most of its body, with some black mixed in, especially around the shoulders and head. But here's the thing that really stuck with me. Parts of its body didn't have hair. The knees were bare, showing this dull greyish skin underneath. There was also a bare patch on what I'd call its chest. The face had less hair too, and I could see these dark eyes watching us. That's what really got me. It was watching us, not just standing there, but observing us with what looked like intelligence. Its head was kind of conical, sloping up from the brow, not round like a human head. And it wasn't alone. Beside it, partially hidden behind the same tree, was a smaller one. This one was probably around 5 by 5, tall with similar coloring. They were standing so still that if they hadn't moved initially, I might never have noticed them at all. I remember my mouth going completely dry. I couldn't swallow. I couldn't speak. I just froze, and I think I grabbed Tommy's arm without even realizing it. Mark finally whispered, "What are you looking at?" He followed my gaze, and I heard him suck in air. I managed to point, my hand shaking so bad I could barely control it. "Do you see that?" I whispered. And that's when it moved. The big one took one deliberate step toward us, moving out slightly from behind the tree. It didn't make any aggressive motion, didn't bare teeth or raise arms or anything like that. Just one step. But that was enough. Mark shouted, "Run!" and grabbed Tommy by the shirt. We all turned at once and started sprinting back down the trail toward our trailer. I've never run so fast in my entire life. I remember the sound of our feet pounding on the dirt path, branches whipping at my face and arms as we tore through the brush. Tommy was crying, but not loudly, more like these terrified little gasps as he tried to keep up. We didn't look back, not once. I was too scared of what I might see if I turned around. Would it be following us, running after us? My imagination was in overdrive, picturing this massive thing crashing through the woods right behind us. as we burst out of the tree line into our backyard. That's when we heard it. The sound still gives me nightmares sometimes. It was this howl, but not like a wolf or coyote. It was almost like a low-pitched air raid siren, starting low and rising in pitch, then dropping again. It echoed through the trees, and right after came the sound of branches breaking, loud cracks, like something big was smashing through the underbrush. We didn't stop until we were inside, slamming the door behind us. My mum was doing laundry and came running when she heard us. "What in the world happened to you three?" she asked, looking at our scratched faces and arms, our mud-covered clothes. Mark was the first to speak. "We saw something in the woods, Aunt Ellen, something big." I was still trying to catch my breath, but I nodded frantically. "It was watching us, Mom. It was really tall with reddish hair, and there was a smaller one with it." My mom's face changed. Not disbelief exactly, but this look of concern I didn't understand at the time. She sat us down at the kitchen table and gave us Kool-Aid while we tried to explain what we'd seen. Tommy was so upset he could barely talk. He just kept saying, "It was big, Mommy, really big." My dad was at work, so Mom called my uncle, Mark's dad, to come over. When he arrived, we told the story again. The adults exchanged these looks I couldn't interpret. Uncle Rob asked specific questions about where exactly we'd seen them, what direction they were facing, if they made any sounds before we ran. That night, my dad came home and talked to us again. He didn't dismiss what we'd seen, which surprised me. Instead, he was serious in a way that made me even more scared. He told us we shouldn't go back to that part of the woods for a while. "Sometimes there are things out there we don't understand," he said. "Best to give them their space." I couldn't sleep that night. Every little creak of our trailer, every sound from outside made me sit bolt upright in bed. Tommy had crawled into my parents' bed, something he hadn't done in years. The next day was Friday, and as luck would have it, I was supposed to go stay with my grandparents for the weekend. They lived about 30 miles away in a small town. My parents thought it might be good for me to get away from the property for a few days. Tommy was supposed to go too, but he came down with a fever that morning, probably from the stress, so he stayed home. I remember hugging my mom extra tight before leaving with my grandpa, who'd driven over to pick me up. I didn't want to leave my family, but I also didn't want to be anywhere near those woods. Sunday evening, when my grandpa brought me home, I knew something else had happened before anyone said a word. My parents had this tense look, and they were speaking in hushed tones in the kitchen. Later that night, my dad finally told me. Friday night, around 2 a.m., something had hit the back of our trailer, hard enough to shake the whole structure. My dad said he grabbed his shotgun and flashlight and went outside, but whatever it was had already run off into the woods. He said he could hear branches breaking and that same howling sound fading into the distance. "It sounded angry," my mom added, her voice barely above a whisper. My dad found dents in the aluminum siding the next morning, about 7 feet up from the ground, too high for a person to make without standing on something, and there were no ladders or anything nearby. We didn't talk much about what happened after that. My parents didn't want to scare us more than we already were, but things changed. We had new rules about being outside. No one was allowed in the woods alone. We had to be home before dark, no exceptions. My dad installed extra outdoor lights around the trailer, and he started keeping his shotgun closer at hand. About 2 weeks later, we heard that the Mitchell kids, who lived about a mile down the road, had seen something in their yard at dusk. They described a large, dark figure picking apples from their tree. When their dad came out on the porch, it disappeared into the woods. I'm 56 years old now, and I've never forgotten what I saw that day. I've read books about Sasquatch sightings, watched documentaries, and talked to other people who've had encounters. Some details vary, but many are eerily similar to what we experienced. I believe what we saw was a female Sasquatch and possibly her offspring or a juvenile. I don't think they meant to harm us initially. They seemed more curious than anything. But I also believe they're capable of violence if they feel threatened or cornered. Whatever hit our trailer that night wasn't just saying hello. The area has been more developed now, with subdivisions and strip malls eating away at the forests. Maybe they've moved deeper into the wilderness, or maybe they're still out there, watching from the tree line, staying just out of sight. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. Never have since that day. Some fears stick with you for life, and sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night and hear something moving outside my window, I still think about those eyes watching us from behind that tree, and I wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting. Oh. Story 11. I still can't shake what happened that day at Camp Oyoboysko. I've tried to forget, tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks, but I know what I saw. We all saw it. It was early October 1977, and the weather was that perfect kind of fall crisp, where the air feels clean in your lungs, but doesn't quite freeze your fingers yet. Me and 4 of my buddies, Rick, Darren, Mike, and Steve, had been planning this hiking trip for months. We were all in our early 20s then, working dead-end jobs and looking for any excuse to escape our small Ohio town for a weekend. My family owned a small cabin at Camp Oyoboysko. Nothing fancy, just a single-room structure with some cots and a wood stove, but it was our base for the weekend. We'd arrived on Friday afternoon, dumped our gear, and spent most of Saturday hiking the trails through Shawnee Forest. The fall colors were just starting to peak, all those yellows and reds standing out against the deep green of the pines that dominated the area. We'd been on the trails since early morning, and by mid-afternoon we were heading back toward my cabin. About a quarter mile from it, there was this little picnic area with a couple weathered wooden tables. It was tucked into this small clearing with a view down into a ravine. You could see the forest stretching out, all those pine trees packed together with patches of oak and maple mixed in. We decided to take a break there, stretch our legs before the final push back to the cabin. It was around 3:30 in the afternoon. The sun was still up but starting to sink behind the trees, casting these long shadows across the ground. Rick had brought some sandwiches, and we were passing around a thermos of coffee, bullshitting about nothing important. I remember I was sitting on the picnic table, feet on the bench, looking out toward the ravine. The others were scattered around, Mike and Steve sitting opposite me, Darren standing near the trail entrance, and Rick digging through his backpack for something. That's when I noticed the movement. About 60 yards away, down in the ravine where the brush got real thick, something was moving through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was a deer. They were common in the area, but the way it moved wasn't right. Deer kind of bound along, but this was a steady, deliberate movement. "Hey," I said, nodding toward the ravine. "You guys see that?" The conversation died as everyone turned to look. The brush was dense, all these ferns and brambles growing between the trees, so we couldn't see the lower half of whatever was moving. But what we could see, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was tall, maybe 6.5 feet, moving on 2 legs through the brush. The upper body was covered in long, shaggy brown hair, not fur exactly, more like human hair, but all over. It was muscular but lean, with broad shoulders that tapered down. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered. Nobody answered. The thing stopped moving for a second, and that's when it turned its head in our direction. I swear my heart stopped beating for a moment. Its face was mostly hidden by the hair, but its eyes... Jesus, those eyes. They were a bright, piercing green that seemed to glow in the shadows of the forest. Not animal eyes. There was something too intelligent in them. We all froze. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I was afraid to even breathe. It felt like those green eyes were staring right through me, seeing something I couldn't. The creature stood perfectly still, just watching us. Then Darren, who'd always been the jumpy one, took a step backward and snapped a twig under his boot. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence, and the creature's head snapped toward him. In one fluid motion, it turned and moved deeper into the ravine, disappearing into the trees. It didn't crash through the underbrush like you'd expect from something that size. It moved almost silently, just a subtle shifting of branches and leaves. "Did you guys just see that?" Steve's voice was barely above a whisper. I think it was a bear," Rick said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Bears don't walk upright for that long," I replied, "and they don't have green eyes." "Bigfoot," Mike suggested with a nervous laugh. "Shut up, man," Darren snapped. "That's not funny." We stood there for a few minutes staring at the spot where the creature had vanished. Part of me wanted to go investigate, to find tracks or something to prove what we'd seen. But a stronger part, the part connected to that primal fear center in your brain, kept me rooted to the spot. Finally, Rick spoke up. "Let's get back to the cabin. It'll be getting dark soon." Nobody argued. We gathered our stuff quickly, not bothering to finish our food or coffee, and headed up the trail toward my cabin. The whole way back, we kept close together, constantly scanning the forest around us. The woods that had seemed so peaceful that morning now felt oppressive, like the trees themselves were watching us. Back at the cabin, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Rick was still pushing the bear theory, saying it must have stood up to look at something, then dropped back down when it moved away. Darren thought it might have been some hunter in a ghillie suit, though none of us could figure out why anyone would wear something like that in these woods. Mike and Steve didn't offer theories, but I could tell they were shaken. Steve kept glancing out the windows, and Mike cleaned his hunting knife 3 times that evening. A nervous habit he had. As for me, I couldn't shake the memory of those green eyes. They hadn't been animal eyes. There was too much awareness in them, but they hadn't been human either. There was something ancient and wild in that gaze that made my skin crawl whenever I thought about it. We tried to distract ourselves as evening fell. I got a fire going in the wood stove, and Rick broke out a bottle of whiskey he'd brought. We played cards and tried to joke around like normal, but the conversation kept circling back to what we'd seen. Each time, someone would change the subject, like if we didn't talk about it, maybe it hadn't happened. Around 8 p.m., we heard the first bark. The caretaker of Camp Oyo Boysko, old Bill Henderson, lived in a house about a quarter-mile from my cabin. He had this German shepherd named Ranger, big dog, well-trained, not the kind that barked at shadows or squirrels. But that night, Ranger started barking, and it wasn't his normal alert bark. This was frantic, almost panicked. "Probably a raccoon in Bill's trash again," Rick said, shuffling the cards. But the barking didn't stop. If anything, it got more intense, more desperate. After about 10 minutes of it, Steve got up and went to the window. "There's lights on at Bill's place," he reported. "He's probably trying to shut that dog up." The barking continued for another 5 minutes. Then we heard Bill's voice, distant but clear in the night air, shouting something we couldn't make out. "Should we go check on him?" Darren asked, looking at me. Before I could answer, the barking suddenly cut off mid-bark. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. "Dog probably finally spotted whatever was bothering it," Mike said, but he didn't sound convinced. We waited, listening. The forest was completely silent. No insects chirping, no night birds calling. Just absolute stillness. It was unnatural, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then we heard the first shot. The sound cracked through the night, making us all jump. A shotgun from the direction of Bill's place. "What the hell?" Rick stood up so fast he knocked over his whiskey. A second shot followed about 10 seconds later, then a third. We all moved to the windows, peering out into the darkness. Bill's place was just far enough away that we could see his porch light and a few windows glowing yellow, but nothing else. "Should we call someone?" Steve asked. "Phone lines don't reach the cabins," I reminded him. Cell phones weren't a thing back then. We'd have to drive to the ranger station. "Or just go over there," Mike suggested, reaching for his jacket. "After hearing gunshots, no way." Darren shook his head. What if it's some kind of hunter dispute or something? We could walk right into the middle of it. We debated what to do for a few minutes. Part of me felt we should check on Bill. He was in his 60s, lived alone except for that dog. But Darren had a point about the gunshots. Finally, we decided to wait 15 minutes. If we heard anything else suspicious, we'd drive to the ranger station to report it. Those 15 minutes stretched like hours. We didn't play cards or talk much, just sat listening to the silence outside. The fire popped in the wood stove, making us all twitch. When the time was up and we hadn't heard anything else, Rick suggested 2 of us should walk over to Bill's place while the others stayed at the cabin. Nobody volunteered at first, but finally I stood up. I'll go. I've known Bill since I was a kid. I'll come with you, Mike said, grabbing a flashlight. We took my rifle, just a .22, not much stopping power, but it made us feel better, and headed out onto the dirt road that connected the cabins. The night was cold, and our breath made clouds in the flashlight beam. The forest around us was still eerily quiet. Bill's place came into view as we rounded a bend in the road, a small house with a covered porch, light spilling from the windows. Everything looked normal, except Ranger wasn't in the yard where he was usually chained. We approached cautiously, calling out as we got close. "Bill, it's Timothy Clark and my friend Mike. Everything okay?" No answer. We reached the bottom of the porch steps and stopped. The front door was closed, but not completely. It was open about an inch, a slice of yellow light showing through. "Bill?" I called again, louder this time. Mike pointed his flashlight toward the side of the house. "Tim," he whispered. "Look." I followed the beam to where it illuminated Bill's truck. The driver's door was open, and even from where we stood I could see things scattered on the ground beside it, like he'd been in a hurry to get something from the cab and drop stuff. My stomach tightened. Something was wrong. "We should check inside," I said, though every instinct was screaming at me to run back to the cabin. We climbed the steps slowly, the old wood creaking under our weight. At the door, I called out once more, then pushed it open with the rifle barrel. The living room looked normal, old furniture, a TV in the corner, hunting trophies on the walls. But there was no sign of Bill. Mike swept the flashlight around, even though the overhead light was on. "Should we check the rest of the house?" he asked. Before I could answer, we heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from somewhere outside, behind the house. It wasn't a dog growl, or a bear growl, or anything I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like it was coming from something with a chest cavity twice the size of a human's. Mike's flashlight beam wavered. "What was that?" "I don't know," I whispered, "but I think we should go. Now." We backed out onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind us. The growl had stopped, but now there was something else, a heavy rustling from the tree line behind Bill's house, like something large moving through the underbrush. We didn't wait to see what it was. We practically flew down those porch steps and ran back up the road toward my cabin. I'm not ashamed to admit it. We ran like scared kids, the beam of Mike's flashlight bouncing wildly ahead of us, my rifle clutched uselessly in my hands. When we burst through the cabin door, the others jumped up, startled by our sudden entrance. "What happened?" Steve demanded. "Did you find Bill?" Between gasps for breath, we explained what we'd found, or rather hadn't found, and the growl we'd heard. "We need to get out of here," Darren said immediately. "Whatever that thing was we saw earlier, maybe it's still around. Maybe it went after Bill and his dog. We can't just leave," I argued. "What about Bill? What if he's hurt?" "If something happened to him, there's nothing we can do," Rick said. "We're not equipped to handle this. We need to get to the ranger station." While we argued, Steve had gone to the window again. "Guys," he interrupted, his voice tight. "There's something moving around outside." We fell silent instantly, all of us turning toward the windows. I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond the glass. But then I heard it. the soft crunch of footsteps on the pine needles and fallen leaves around the cabin. "Turn off the lights," Mike whispered. Rick moved to the kerosene lamp we'd been using and turned it down until it went out. The only light now came from the small window of the wood stove, casting a dim red glow that barely illuminated our faces. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin slowly. Whatever was out there, it was big. Each step was heavy, deliberate. It paused near each window, like it was trying to look inside. We huddled in the center of the cabin, barely breathing. My rifle felt like a toy in my hands. "The car," Steve whispered. "We need to make a run for it." My station wagon was parked about 30 feet from the cabin door. In normal circumstances, that would be nothing. A few seconds sprint, but now, with whatever was out there, it seemed like miles. The footsteps had reached the front of the cabin. There was a long pause, then a new sound, a slow scratching against the wooden door. Not like an animal pawing to get in, but almost like someone running their fingernails down the wood, testing it. Darren clutched my arm so hard it hurt. We all stared at the door, watching the handle. Would it turn? The cabin had a simple lock, nothing that would stop a determined intruder. The scratching stopped. Another pause, then a sharp, loud knock on the door. I almost dropped the rifle. That wasn't an animal. Animals don't knock. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 3 more knocks, evenly spaced, deliberate. Then, the most terrifying thing of all, a voice. Low, distorted, like someone who didn't quite know how to form words properly, but unmistakably trying to mimic human speech. "Let me in." Steve clamped his hand over his mouth to stifle a cry. Mike had gone completely pale, visible even in the dim red glow. "Oh, God," Darren whispered. "It can talk." The handle turned slowly, and we all tensed, but the lock held, and after a moment, the handle returned to its position. Silence fell again. We waited, listening for footsteps, for breathing, for anything. But there was nothing. Had it gone? We stayed frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Rick moved toward one of the windows. Keeping low, he peered out cautiously. "I don't see anything," he whispered. "It could be waiting just out of sight," Mike replied. "We can't stay here all night," I said. "We need to make a move." We formulated a plan. We'd all run for the car together. Mike had the keys. He'd get in first and start the engine while the rest of us piled in. The rifle probably wouldn't stop whatever was out there, but it might distract it long enough for us to get away. We gathered our jackets, not bothering with the rest of our gear. On a count of 3, I yanked open the door and we bolted toward the car. The night air hit me like a wall as I ran, my boots pounding on the dirt. The car seemed impossibly far away. I kept expecting to feel something grab me from behind, to hear that terrible voice again. But we made it. Mike fumbled with the keys, swearing under his breath, while the rest of us crowded around the car, scanning the darkness. I kept the rifle raised, though I had no idea where to point it. The engine roared to life, and we all scrambled inside, Mike driving, Rick in the passenger seat, the rest of us crammed in the back. Mike threw the car into reverse, backing up so fast we skidded on the dirt, then shifted into drive and floored it. The headlights cut through the darkness as we sped down the dirt road, bouncing over ruts and potholes. No one spoke. I kept looking out the back window, expecting to see something chasing us, but there was only darkness. We didn't stop until we reached the ranger station 20 minutes later. We spilled out of the car, talking over each other as we tried to explain to the startled night ranger what had happened. They sent a team out to check on Bill, but I never found out what they discovered. We didn't stick around. As soon as we'd given our statements, we drove straight back to town, not stopping until we were under streetlights again. I've never been back to Camp Oyoboisco. My family sold the cabin the following year. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was some hermit living in the woods. Maybe we all worked ourselves into a panic over nothing. But I know what I saw in those woods. I know what we all heard outside the cabin. And sometimes, when I'm falling asleep, I still see those piercing green eyes staring at me through the trees. And I hear that voice, that terrible, almost human voice, asking to be let in. Story 12. I never thought I'd share this story beyond my close circle of friends. For 46 years, I've gone back and forth about what I saw. But the image of it has never left me, not for a single day. It's engraved in my memory like nothing else. This happened in August 1977. I was 23 years old, working night shifts at the printing factory in Bryan, Ohio. Most nights were identical. Work my 2 p.m. to midnight shift, then drive home through the county back roads. The drive usually took about 35 minutes, and I'd be home by 12:45 a.m. at the latest. My routine was set in stone. I'd take Highway 15 out of Bryan, cut across some county roads, and eventually wind my way to my apartment in Defiance. That night started like any other. It was a Thursday, and I remember feeling exhausted after a particularly busy shift. We'd been rushing a big order for a catalog company, and I'd spent most of the night fixing paper jams in the printing press. My hands were stained with ink that never seemed to fully wash off, and my lower back ached from standing all shift. The factory parking lot was nearly empty when I climbed into my '74 Chevy Nova. The car had been giving me trouble recently, something with the carburetor, but it started fine that night. I remember the dashboard clock read 12:08 a.m. when I pulled out of the lot. The radio was playing some song by Fleetwood Mac, and I cranked it up to keep myself alert for the drive home. The night was unusually dark. We'd had a new moon, and out in the country, away from town lights, the darkness was almost complete, except for my headlights cutting through it. The temperature was in the mid-60s, so I had my windows rolled down halfway, letting the summer air rush in as I drove. The smell of freshly cut corn filled the car. Harvest season was approaching, and the farmers had been busy. About 20 minutes into my drive, I turned onto County Road 192. It's a straight stretch that runs through farmland, with occasional patches of woods. I was making good time, cruising at about 60 mph. The road was empty. I hadn't passed another car in at least 10 minutes. Around the halfway point of County Road 192, there's an old cement bridge that crosses over Cedar Creek. It's nothing special, just a small bridge, maybe 15 feet long, with concrete sides about 3 feet high. I've crossed it hundreds of times without a second thought. The creek below is usually just a trickle, especially in late summer, running through a ditch about 6 feet below the road. As I approached the bridge, my headlights swept across something that made me instantly slow down. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. In the ditch, right beside the bridge, was what looked like a person. But not a person, not at all. It was standing in the creek bed, partially obscured by the bridge, but clearly visible in my headlights. What hit me first was the height. Its head was well above the top of the bridge wall, which would put it at least 8 feet tall, maybe 9. And it was covered, completely covered, in thick, shaggy brown hair. I immediately took my foot off the gas, slowing to maybe 40 meters mph as I crossed the bridge. The thing, and I don't know what else to call it, turned toward my headlights. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, but I saw the shine of eyes reflecting back at me. They weren't animal eyes, not like a deer's. They seemed deeper set, more aware. For the briefest second, our eyes met. I felt a cold rush of fear, unlike anything I've ever experienced. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel, and I felt sweat immediately break out across my forehead and back. It was primal fear, the kind that bypasses all rational thought. My body knew I was in danger before my mind caught up. As I passed the bridge, I looked in my rearview mirror. The creature was still there, now turning to follow my car with its gaze. I'll never forget the way it moved. Not like a bear or any animal I've ever seen. It moved with purpose, with awareness. It moved like a person would, but no person is built like that. I floored it. The Nova's engine roared as I pushed it to 70, then 80 miles down that dark country road. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel my pulse in my temples. I didn't slow down until I reached the outskirts of Defiance, nearly running a stop sign in my panic. When I finally pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, I sat in my car for almost 20 minutes, trying to calm down enough to walk inside. My t-shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. I kept replaying what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it was something normal, a bear maybe, or a man in some kind of costume, but I knew better. What I saw wasn't any of those things. I barely slept that night. I kept seeing those eyes in the darkness of my bedroom. When my alarm went off at 8 a.m., I'd maybe gotten 2 hours of fitful sleep. I called in sick to work, something I rarely did, and made myself a pot of coffee with shaking hands. By 9:30, I'd convinced myself I needed to go back. In the daylight, I needed to see if there was any evidence, any explanation for what I'd witnessed. Part of me hoped I'd find something obvious, a bunch of weeds or a tree that in the darkness and with my tired eyes I'd mistaken for something extraordinary. That would have been a relief. I drove slowly this time, my hand still not entirely steady on the wheel. The morning was bright and clear, typical August weather. Farm equipment moved in the fields, and everything looked so normal it almost made the previous night feel like a dream. When I reached the bridge, I pulled my car onto the narrow shoulder and sat there for a good 5 minutes, just staring. In the daylight, the bridge was exactly what it had always been. An unremarkable concrete structure spanning a small creek. The ditch beside it was clearly visible, with a trickle of water running through it and some scrubby vegetation along its banks. I finally worked up the courage to get out of my car. The summer heat was already building, making the air shimmer above the asphalt. I walked carefully to the bridge and looked down into the ditch where I'd seen the creature. There was nothing there. No unusual tracks. No broken vegetation, nothing that would suggest anything large had stood there hours earlier. The weeds growing in the ditch were short, nothing that could have been mistaken for an 8-foot-tall creature, even in the dark. The ground was mostly dry, too hard to hold footprints. I climbed down into the ditch, my sneakers sinking slightly into the mud near the water. Standing where I believed the creature had been, I looked up at the bridge. From this angle, the concrete wall came up to about my chest. I'm 5'10". Whatever I'd seen had its head 2 to 3 feet above that wall, which meant it had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. I spent almost an hour searching the area, looking for any sign, broken branches, unusual tracks, tufts of hair caught on vegetation, anything to confirm what I'd seen. I found nothing. The area was completely ordinary, giving no hint of the extraordinary thing I'd encountered. On my way back to my car, I noticed a farmer working in the adjacent field. I waved him over, trying to appear casual. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with leathery skin and suspicious eyes. When I asked if he'd ever seen anything unusual around the bridge, particularly at night, his expression changed. He didn't answer directly, but he told me that his cattle sometimes got agitated for no apparent reason, especially those grazing in the pasture closest to the woods beyond the creek. He'd written it off to coyotes, but admitted he'd never actually seen any predators around. When I pressed a little further, mentioning I might have seen something unusual the night before, he changed the subject and quickly returned to his work. His reaction only unsettled me more. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. I couldn't reconcile the ordinary bridge I'd just inspected with the extraordinary encounter from the night before. By the time I returned to my apartment, I'd cycled through a dozen different explanations, each less convincing than the last. The rest of that day passed in a blur. I remember calling my buddy Tom, trying to tell him what I'd seen, but stopping short when I realized how insane it would sound. Instead, I just asked if he wanted to grab a beer that evening. I needed company, needed to be around normal things and normal people. I went back to work the next day, but I changed my route home. For weeks, I avoided County Road 192 entirely, adding an extra 15 minutes to my commute. When co-workers asked why, I made up a story about construction work. Eventually, after about a month, curiosity got the better of fear. One night after my shift, I deliberately took my old route home. As I approached the bridge, I slowed down to about 30 mph, my hands clenched on the steering wheel, my body tense. But nothing was there. Just an ordinary bridge on an ordinary country road. I've driven that route hundreds of times since then, sometimes deliberately at midnight, sometimes slowing down at the bridge. I've never seen the creature again. But I've never forgotten it either. Over the years, I've done research. I've read accounts of similar sightings in Ohio and throughout the Midwest. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others have different names for it. I don't know what to call what I saw, but I know what I experienced. I moved away from Defiance County back in '85, and I rarely return these days. But sometimes I dream about that bridge and what stood beside it. In my dreams, sometimes it follows me. Sometimes it speaks. I always wake up before I can hear what it says. I'm 69 years old now. I've had a normal life. Got married, raised 2 kids, held down a good job until retirement. From the outside, nothing about me suggests I'm someone who had an encounter with something unexplainable. Most days, I don't think about it. But on dark nights, especially when I'm driving on empty country roads, I can't help but scan the ditches beside the bridges I cross, because I know what's out there. Or at least, I know something is out there, something tall and covered in brown hair, something that watches from beside bridges in the darkest part of night, something that, for reasons I'll never understand, let me drive away. Story 13. I've never really talked about this outside my family. It happened in January 1978, when I was 11 years old. We lived in Morrow County, Ohio, in this old farmhouse that had been in my dad's family for generations. Behind our property were woods that seemed to stretch on forever. At least to my young mind they did. That particular Saturday morning was freezing cold, the kind of cold that makes your lungs hurt when you breathe in too deep. There had been a heavy snowfall earlier that week, but the day was clear, perfect for hunting, according to my dad. He was determined to take me and my older brother Tom fox hunting in the woods. Dad was always trying to make men out of us, as he put it. I remember pulling on these thick wool socks my grandma had knitted for me. They were itchy as hell, but necessary in that weather. My hunting boots were still a bit too big. Dad said I'd grow into them, so I had to wear extra socks to keep them from slipping off. I hated those boots. They made my feet sweat even in the cold, and by the end of the day, they'd be soaking. Dad woke us up before dawn. The kitchen was the only warm place in the house, thanks to Mom's old cast-iron stove. She made us a huge breakfast: eggs, bacon, and these thick pancakes that sat in your stomach like rocks. "You boys need your strength," she said, pouring what felt like a gallon of maple syrup over my stack. I wasn't even hungry that early, but Dad wouldn't let us leave until we'd cleaned our plates. We headed out just as the sky was turning that weird greyish blue. The snow crunched under our boots as we walked toward the shed where Dad kept the rifles. I remember the smell of gun oil and leather as he handed me my .22. It wasn't my first time hunting, but I still felt this weird mix of pride and nervousness holding it. Dad had drilled gun safety into us since we were little, so I was careful to keep the barrel pointed at the ground as we walked. The woods behind our house always seemed different in winter. Without leaves on the trees, you could see much further, but somehow that made it feel more exposed, like the woods themselves were stripped naked. Our breath came out in these big white clouds as we trudged through the snow. Dad led the way, following what he said were fox tracks. I was in the middle, with Tom bringing up the rear. About a half-mile in, I noticed something strange. Tracks in the snow that definitely weren't from any fox. They were big, way too big, with what looked like 5 toes splayed out in the snow. I called out to Dad, "Hey, look at these tracks. What made these?" He barely glanced back. "Probably just a coyote. Keep moving, Danny, we're losing light." But they weren't coyote tracks. I knew what those looked like. These were different, wider, deeper in the snow, like whatever made them was heavy. And they were spaced further apart, like whatever it was had a much longer stride than any animal I knew of. I tried to point them out again, but Dad was in one of his moods, completely focused on the hunt. "Daniel, I said keep moving," he snapped. So I shut up and followed. But I kept seeing those tracks, sometimes veering away from our path, sometimes running parallel to it. We spent the whole morning tracking through the woods without much luck. Dad was getting frustrated. By midday, we were deep in a part of the forest I didn't recognize. The trees were older here, massive trunks with bark so rough it could tear your skin if you rubbed against it. There was a ravine that cut through this section, and Dad decided we should drive down into it to see if we could flush out any foxes from the undergrowth. As we made our way down the slope, I don't know how to describe it exactly. It was like that feeling when you think someone's watching you. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming urge to turn around. When I did, there was nothing there, just trees and snow. But the feeling didn't go away. "You okay, Danny?" Tom asked, noticing me constantly looking over my shoulder. "Yeah, just thought I heard something," I lied. I didn't want him thinking I was scared. The ravine was darker, the high walls on either side blocking out much of the light. The snow was thinner here, patchy in places where the ground was exposed, dark, frozen mud that sucked at our boots. It was colder too, the kind of damp cold that seeps into your bones. We spent another couple hours down there, with Dad getting increasingly annoyed at our lack of success. By late afternoon, he finally admitted defeat. "Sun's going to set soon. Let's head back," he grunted. I was relieved. That feeling of being watched had only grown stronger, and now every crack of a branch or rustle made me jump. The walk back seemed longer somehow. My legs were tired and my hands were numb despite my gloves. When we finally broke through the tree line and saw our house in the distance, with smoke coming from the chimney, I almost ran toward it. But Dad insisted we properly unload our rifles in the backyard before going inside. We were standing there, the three of us, with our backs to the pasture that separated our yard from the woods. I was focusing on safely unloading my gun when Tom suddenly grabbed my shoulder. "Dad," he whispered, his voice tight. "Dad, look, over there by the back fence." I turned around, and that's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a bear. It was moving on all fours along the back of our pasture, near where the creek cuts through on its way to the woods. It was big, much bigger than any bear I'd ever seen in our parts, and its fur was this weird brownish color that didn't look right. "Stay still," Dad said, his voice eerily calm. He raised his rifle not to shoot, but to look through the scope. "Don't make any sudden movements." As we watched, the thing stopped. And then, God, I still get chills thinking about it. It stood up, on 2 legs, standing upright. It was tall, so much taller than any man I'd ever seen. 7 feet at least, maybe more. Its arms were long, hanging down past its knees, with this longer fur that swayed slightly in the breeze. It just stood there for a moment, looking around. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but I swear it was scanning the area, like it was looking for something, or someone. Then it took a step toward our fence, not walking on all fours anymore, but upright, like a person. Its posture was almost human, but wrong somehow, too fluid or too stiff. I couldn't tell which. When it reached the fence, just a simple 5-foot-high wooden fence that marked the edge of our property, It reached out one of those long arms and touched the top rail. Not like an animal would, but with what looked like fingers. Then, without any apparent effort, it stepped over the fence. Just lifted one leg and stepped right over like it was nothing. "What the hell is that?" Tom whispered, his voice cracking. None of us answered. None of us knew. The creature moved into the heavy thicket that grew along the creek. For a few seconds, we could see its upper body moving through the bare branches, and then it was gone. We stood there in complete silence. I remember the sound of my heartbeat in my ears was so loud I thought the others must hear it too. I was shaking, not from the cold anymore, but from fear. "Dad," I finally managed to say. "What was that?" He lowered his rifle slowly. His face was pale, and I'd never seen my father look scared before. "I don't know, son," he said, "but I saw it clear as day through the scope. That wasn't normal." Tom and I had seen it too, without any scope. Close enough to make out details that still don't make sense to me. The way it moved wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a costume. It was something else. We hurried inside after that. Mom knew something was wrong the minute we walked in. "What happened?" "You all look like you've seen a ghost." Dad tried to brush it off. "Thought we saw something in the pasture, probably just a bear," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I could tell he didn't believe his own words. That night, I couldn't sleep. My bedroom window faced the pasture, and I kept imagining I could see that figure standing out there, watching our house. I finally dragged my blanket into the hallway and slept on the floor outside my parents' room, something I hadn't done since I was 6. The next morning, Dad and Tom went out to check the pasture. I refused to go with them. They came back looking confused and worried. They'd found tracks, huge, human-like tracks that matched the ones I'd seen in the woods. They followed them to the creek where they disappeared. "Maybe it was just a really big guy," Tom suggested, but none of us believed that. No man could step over our fence like it was a small hurdle. No man would be wandering the woods in January without proper clothing, and no man had proportions like what we saw. Dad forbade us from telling anyone outside the family. "People will think we're crazy," he said, "or worse, they'll believe us and come looking for it. Either way, I don't want strangers tramping all over our property." So we kept quiet. But things changed after that day. Dad installed extra locks on all the doors. He started keeping his shotgun by the bed instead of in the gun cabinet, and neither Tom nor I were allowed to play in the woods alone anymore. A few weeks later, there was a story in the local paper about strange animal sightings in Morrow County. A couple of hunters claimed they'd seen what they described as a giant, hairy, man-like creature near the state forest, about 10 miles from our property. Most people laughed it off as hillbillies who'd had too much to drink while hunting. Dad didn't laugh. He cut out the article and tucked it away in his desk drawer. I saw him looking at it sometimes, late at night, when he thought everyone else was asleep. We never saw the creature again, at least not that clearly. But there were times, especially in winter, when I'd catch glimpses of something moving between the trees at the edge of our property. And sometimes, when I was alone in the yard, I'd get that same feeling, the one from the ravine, like I was being watched. I'm 56 years old now. My parents are long gone, and Tom lives out of state. The old house belongs to someone else. But I still think about that day in January 1978. I've read about Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings over the years, seen the blurry photos and shaky videos. Some of the descriptions match what we saw, but others don't. All I know for certain is what the three of us witnessed that cold winter day in Ohio. Something that shouldn't exist, but does. Something that knew we were watching it, just as it had been watching us. Something that, for whatever reason, wanted us to see it. I still don't go into the woods in winter, and to this day, the sound of snow crunching underfoot is enough to make me look over my shoulder, half expecting to see those tracks again, wide, deep impressions in the snow, leading into the darkness between the trees. Story 14. I'm still not sure why I'm writing this down after all these years. Maybe it's because my brother Noah passed away last year, and he was the only other person who knew what happened that day. Maybe it's because I keep seeing those stupid TV shows where they're always looking for Bigfoot but never finding anything. Or maybe it's just because, even at 55 years old, I still check my window every time I hear something on the porch at night. It was February 1978. I was 10, and Noah was 8. We lived in Newbury, Ohio, in this little ranch house at the edge of some woods. Not deep forest or anything, just enough trees to make you feel like you weren't completely in suburbia. Our backyard opened up to this field that eventually led to more houses about a quarter-mile away. That winter was brutal. I remember my dad complaining about how he'd never seen so much snow and how the plows couldn't keep up. The snow was piled so high on either side of our driveway that Noah and I would dig tunnels through it and pretend we were Arctic explorers. The day it happened, we'd been at our friend Danny Miller's house playing Atari. His family had just gotten Space Invaders, and we spent hours taking turns trying to beat each other's scores. We stayed longer than we should have, and it was getting dark when Danny's mom finally said we needed to head home for dinner. It was snowing again. Not a blizzard or anything, but steady, the kind that makes everything quiet. You know that weird silence that comes with heavy snow, where the world feels like it's wrapped in cotton? It was like that. I can still feel how cold my face was and how my boots squeaked with each step. The walk home was only about 10 minutes, cutting through backyards. Noah was complaining about being cold, and I remember being annoyed because I told him to wear his thicker gloves, but he never listened to me. We were coming up on our house from the back. There's this big picture window in our kitchen that looked out onto the yard, and I could see the light on. Mum was probably making dinner. I remember thinking about how we were going to get yelled at for being late, and I was trying to come up with an excuse. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a shadow, or maybe someone from the neighborhood. It was standing near this old maple tree we had, about 30 feet from the back porch. It wasn't moving, just standing there, looking away from us, toward the house. I grabbed Noah's arm to stop him. He started to say something, but I shushed him. I remember the exact feeling in my stomach, like when you're at the top of a roller coaster, right before the drop. This mix of excitement and pure fear. "What is that?" Noah whispered. His breath came out in a cloud that hung in the air between us. The figure was tall, much taller than our dad, who was about 6 feet. It had to be at least 6'5", maybe more. It was standing almost straight, but with a slight hunch to its shoulders, and it was covered in hair. Not super thick fur like you see in the movies, but longer, stringier hair. Brown, but with some lighter patches. You could see skin underneath in places. I didn't answer Noah because I didn't know what to say. My brain was trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a person in a coat? But the proportions were all wrong. The arms hung down too far, and the legs seemed too thick. "Maybe it's a bear," Noah whispered, but even as he said it, we both knew it wasn't. Bears don't stand like that. I had this crazy thought that maybe we should try to scare it away, like it might be dangerous, might try to attack us or break into the house where Mom was. So I whispered to Noah that we should try to find something to defend ourselves with. There were sticks and stuff around, but everything was buried under the snow. We started feeling around with our boots, trying to find something solid under the snow. Noah kicked at a mound of snow, and it made this crunching sound. And that's when it turned around. I've had 45 years to try to forget that face, and I still can't. It wasn't like the movies or the pictures you see online. It wasn't some gorilla face or a wolf man or whatever. It was almost human, but wrong. Its face was darker than the hair, like a deep tan or brown color. The eyes were set back under a prominent brow, but they weren't animal eyes. They were aware. The nose was wide and flat, and the mouth was slightly open, showing teeth that looked human but bigger. But it was the eyes that got me. Because when it turned and looked at us, there was recognition there, not like a deer caught in headlights, more like when you walk into a room and realize someone else is there. A consciousness. We locked eyes for maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like forever. I couldn't move. Noah was gripping my coat so hard I could feel his fingernails through the fabric. I think I stopped breathing. Then it moved. Holy shit, it moved fast for something so big, in snow that was nearly 2 feet deep. It shouldn't have been able to move like that, but it turned and just took off, not running on all fours like you'd expect, but on 2 legs, pushing through the snow like it was nothing. It circled around the side of our house and disappeared. The whole thing happened in maybe 15-20 seconds. When it was gone, Noah and I just stood there. I remember my legs were shaking so bad I thought I might fall over. Noah started crying, not loud, just these quiet tears streaming down his face. "We need to get inside," I managed to say, and we ran. We didn't follow where it went. We went straight for the back door. I fumbled with the handle, my mittens making it hard to grip, and practically fell into the kitchen. Mom was at the stove stirring something. She turned around, surprised. "You boys are late. Dinner's almost—" She stopped when she saw our faces. "What happened? Are you hurt?" I tried to explain, but the words came out all jumbled. Noah was still crying and he kept pointing toward the window. Mom thought we'd gotten into a fight with some other kids or something. She made us sit down, take off our wet coats, and drink some hot chocolate. "There was a monster in the yard," Noah finally said, his voice small. Mom smiled, that smile parents give when kids are being silly. "Honey, there's no such thing as monsters." "It wasn't a monster," I insisted. It was like a man, but bigger, with hair all over." "Like a bear?" she asked, humoring us. "No!" Noah shouted, suddenly angry. "It walked like a person. It looked at us." Mom checked the window, told us it was probably just one of the neighbors in a big winter coat, or maybe Mr. Peterson from down the street, who had that big bushy beard. We tried to argue, but she wasn't really listening. Adults never do when kids talk about stuff like this. Dad was working late that night. He was a truck dispatcher, and February was always busy because of the weather. Mom made us eat dinner, which I barely touched. Noah kept looking out the window, jumping at every sound. She sent us to bed early, probably thinking we were overtired from playing at Danny's all day. Our bedroom was at the back of the house, with a window that looked out onto the yard where we'd seen it. Neither of us wanted to go in there, but we didn't have a choice. We got into our pajamas without talking much. I took the bed by the door, and Noah took the one by the window. We always slept that way. Big brother by the door to protect from whatever might come in, little brother by the window because he liked to look at the stars. But that night, Noah asked if we could switch. "I don't want to sleep by the window," he whispered. I said no. Not because I was brave, but because I was terrified. I couldn't stand the thought of being closer to whatever was out there. It's one of the things I've felt guilty about my whole life. We left the lights on and got into bed. Mum came in around 9:30 and turned them off, telling us to get some sleep. "No more monster talk," she said, kissing our foreheads. "You'll have nightmares." As if we needed help with that, the house got quiet. I could hear the furnace running and the occasional creak of the house settling. Noah wasn't asleep. I could tell by his breathing. Neither was I. Every sound made me tense up. The wind against the window, the ice cracking on the roof, the snow sliding off the branches outside. Then we heard it. Footsteps on the porch outside our window. Slow, heavy footsteps. The wood creaked under the weight of whatever was out there. Noah made this small, strangled sound. I wanted to tell him it was nothing, just the cold making the wood contract or something, but I knew better. Those were footsteps, deliberate, searching. They stopped right outside our window. The curtains were drawn, but they were thin. If there was something right outside, pressing against the glass, it would see us. and we would see it. I heard a soft scraping against the window, like fingers or claws testing the glass. Noah was crying silently again. I wanted to run to him, to pull him into my bed, but I was paralyzed with fear. The scraping continued for what felt like forever, but was probably less than a minute. Then there was a soft thud, like something leaning against the house. I swear I could hear breathing, not loud, just this steady, rhythmic sound that was slightly too deep to be human. That's when Noah broke. He let out this cry and bolted from his bed to mine. I grabbed him, and we both tumbled onto the floor. Without even thinking, we ran for the door, threw it open, and sprinted down the hall to the living room where Dad's recliner was. Dad had gotten home while we were in bed, and he was half asleep in his chair with the TV on low. He startled when we came tearing in, both of us crying and trying to talk at once. "Whoa, whoa," he said, sitting up. "What's going on?" "It's outside our window," Noah sobbed. "The monster from earlier." Dad looked confused. "What monster?" I tried to explain what we'd seen before, and how now it was on the porch outside our room. Dad sighed, obviously thinking this was just us being kids, making up stories. "There's something scraping at our window," I insisted. "Listen." Dad got up, probably to humor us, and walked down the hall to our room. He flipped on the lights, went to the window and pulled back the curtain. He stood there for a moment, looking out, then opened the window and leaned out slightly. "Nothing here, boys," he called back to us. We were hovering in the doorway, afraid to come in. "See for yourselves." I didn't want to, but I forced myself to walk over. Noah stayed put. Dad lifted me up so I could see out the window. The porch was empty, just fresh snow, undisturbed except for what looked like some fallen icicles that had melted slightly against the wood. "But we heard it," I said, my voice small even to my own ears. Dad set me down and ruffled my hair. "The house makes all kinds of noises in winter, Ethan. Pipes, wood expanding and contracting, plus all the ice outside. Your mom told me about your monster earlier. I think you boys just scared yourselves." He went outside anyway, walking around the house with a flashlight. I watched from the window as the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but pristine snow. When he came back in, he was shivering. "Nothing out there but cold," he said. "Now back to bed, both of you, and no more scary stories before bedtime." We slept in the living room that night anyway. Dad didn't argue much. I think he figured we'd just have nightmares if he forced us back to our room. He brought out some blankets, and we made a fort on the floor. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face looking at me. The next day, I went outside to check. I told myself I was being stupid, that Dad was right and we'd just scared ourselves. But I had to know. The snow around the maple tree where we'd first seen it was disturbed, but it could have been from anything. The wind, maybe, or some animal. But then I walked around to the side of the house, following where I'd seen it run. There were impressions in the snow, deep ones. Too big for a person, too defined for a random drift or shadow. They circled the house exactly like I remembered it running, and they ended at our bedroom window, where there were deeper impressions, like something had stood there for a while. I didn't show Noah. I didn't tell my parents. I just came back inside and tried to forget about it. We never saw it again, at least not clearly. But for the rest of that winter, and periodically for years after, I'd sometimes catch a glimpse of something at the edge of the woods, a shadow that was too tall, too oddly shaped to be a person. And sometimes, on cold nights when snow was falling, I'd hear those footsteps on the porch again. Noah and I talked about it sometimes, but less and less as we got older. He moved to California after college, said he couldn't stand the snow anymore. I stayed in Ohio, though I moved to Columbus where there are more people and fewer woods. I still can't explain what we saw that day. I've read about Bigfoot sightings and looked at sketches people have drawn, but none of them quite match what I remember. Sometimes I almost convinced myself it was just our imagination, two kids who'd watched too many monster movies. But then I remember those eyes, that awareness, the way it moved through deep snow like it was nothing, the footsteps outside our window, and I still checked the locks twice before bed. Story 15. I still get cold sweats thinking about it. It's been 45 years, but what happened at Porter Lake still feels like yesterday. I've tried therapy, medication, hell, even hypnosis, but nothing gets rid of the memories or the nightmares. My name's James. Back in March 1978, my buddy Marcus and I decided to do some camping and fishing at this remote spot in Porter County, Ohio. We were both 24, just a couple of regular guys who worked at the steel mill in Cleveland. Camping was our escape from the grind, you know. We'd been friends since high school, gone camping dozens of times before. This was supposed to be just another weekend trip. We arrived Friday afternoon and set up camp about 50 yards from the lake's edge. Perfect spot, with a good view of the water, but with enough tree cover to block the wind. The weather was unusually mild for March in Ohio, maybe mid-50s during the day. We got the tent up, gathered firewood, and cracked open a couple beers. Normal stuff. That first evening we grilled some burgers, talked about work, sports, the usual. Nothing weird. We turned in around 11. I remember checking my watch before zipping up my sleeping bag. The stars were incredible that night, no light pollution out there. The strangeness started Saturday evening. We'd spent the day fishing, caught a few decent bass, nothing spectacular. As the sun started setting, we were sitting by our campfire, cooking up our catch. That's when I noticed something odd on the lake. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the setting sun, but the sun was behind us, not over the water. Marcus, you see that? I pointed toward the center of the lake. There was this light, not like a boat light or a flashlight. This was bigger, maybe the size of a car, just hovering about 10 feet above the water. It had this weird pulsating glow, not quite white, not quite blue, kind of like those mercury vapor street lamps, but brighter and with this rhythmic pulsing. What the hell is that? Marcus stood up, shielding his eyes to get a better look. The strangest part wasn't even the light itself. It was how I felt looking at it, like I knew I should be terrified seeing something so unnatural, but I wasn't. Instead, I felt this odd calm, almost like the fear response in my brain had been switched off. Marcus later told me he felt the same way. We stood there watching it for maybe 5 minutes. The light never moved, just hovered and pulsed. Then, without any warning, it shot straight up into the sky and vanished. 1 second it was there, the next, gone. No sound, no trail, nothing. That's when the fear finally kicked in. It was like a delayed reaction, like my brain suddenly remembered how to be scared. My heart started racing, and I felt sick to my stomach. What the fuck was that? Marcus's voice was shaking. Weather balloon, I suggested weakly, knowing damn well it wasn't. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some military test or ball lightning or some atmospheric phenomenon. Nothing fit, but we didn't want to leave. We'd driven 3 hours to get there, and we still had our fishing gear set up, so we decided to stay like idiots. After a few more beers to calm our nerves, we convinced ourselves it was nothing to worry about. The human mind is good at that, normalizing the abnormal so you can function. We even joked about it as night fell. Maybe it's aliens checking out our fishing techniques. Marcus laughed, but it was nervous laughter. Around 10 p.m., we decided to do some night fishing. The lake was supposed to have good catfish, and they bite better after dark. We grabbed our rods, tackle box, and a couple flashlights, then headed down to the water's edge. The night was clear and cold, with a 3/4 moon reflecting on the lake. We'd been fishing for maybe 20 minutes when we heard it. Footsteps, heavy ones, coming from the wooded area about 30 yards to our right. Not like a deer or raccoon. These were heavy, deliberate steps that made the ground vibrate slightly, like something big was walking through the underbrush. Probably a bear, Marcus whispered, but there weren't supposed to be bears in that part of Ohio. And we both knew it. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer this time. I fumbled for my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. Marcus did the same. Our beams cut through the darkness and illuminated the tree line. That's when I saw it. Standing between two large oak trees was this figure, tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more, covered in dark hair or fur, not like a bear standing on its hind legs. This thing was shaped like a man, but wrong. Its arms hung down past its knees. Its face was hard to make out, but I could see eyes reflecting our flashlight beams, yellow-green, like a cat's eyes, but larger. Jesus Christ! Marcus breathed next to me. My hand was already reaching for the pistol I kept in my jacket pocket, a .38 Special my dad had given me for protection when camping. I'd never actually fired it outside a range before. The creature didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. I could see its chest moving as it breathed. "Get behind me," I told Marcus, pulling out the gun. I aimed at the thing's center mass and fired. The sound was deafening in the quiet night. The creature flinched, but didn't fall. I fired again, and again, 6 shots total. The entire cylinder. I'm a decent shot, and it was only about 30 yards away. I should have hit it multiple times. After the last shot, the thing crouched down. Not like it was injured, but like it was trying to hide. It moved behind one of the trees, way faster than something that size should be able to move. "Did you hit it?" Marcus was practically hyperventilating. "Had to. At that range, had to." We didn't wait to find out. We dropped our fishing gear and ran back to the campsite. I reloaded the revolver with shaking hands while Marcus grabbed his hunting knife. Like that would do any good against whatever the hell we'd seen. We debated making a run for the car, which was parked about a quarter-mile away at the trailhead. But that would mean going through the woods, possibly right past that thing, so we decided to stay in the tent, figuring we'd be able to hear it approach on the dry leaves if it came for us. That was a mistake. We zipped ourselves in the tent, flashlights on, weapons ready. For about 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then we heard it. A heavy thudding sound coming from the right side of the tent. Then another from the left. Then the back. Then the front. It was circling us, pounding on the ground as it moved, like it was trying to scare us. It was working. "It's toying with us," Marcus whispered, his face pale in the flashlight beam. The pounding got faster, more urgent. The whole tent was vibrating. I could hear branches snapping, undergrowth being crushed. Whatever it was getting closer, tightening the circle. Then it touched the tent, not a poke or a grab. It ran its hand, paw, whatever, down the side of the tent from top to bottom. The fabric bulged inward from the pressure. I could see the outline of something huge dragging down the nylon. I fired 2 shots through the tent wall where I'd seen the shape. The noise was even louder inside the confined space, leaving my ears ringing. There was a sound after the shots. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream. Something in between, something I've never heard before or since. It echoed across the lake and through the trees. "Go, go, go!" I shouted, unzipping the tent entrance. We bolted, left everything except my gun and our flashlights, ran like hell through the woods toward the car. I kept waiting to feel something grab me from behind, but nothing did. We reached the car, fumbled with the keys, and got inside. I started it up and floored it, gravel spraying as we tore out of there. Neither of us spoke for the first 20 miles. We just breathed, trying to process what had happened. That's when the physical symptoms started. First was the thirst, like I'd been walking in a desert for days. My mouth felt bone dry no matter how much water I drank. Then came the nausea, hitting us both at the same time. We had to pull over twice so Marcus could throw up on the side of the road. By the time we got back to Cleveland, we both felt like we had the worst flu of our lives. Fever, chills, muscle aches. But it was more than that. There was this overwhelming sense of depression, like something vital had been drained out of us. We didn't talk about what happened for a few days. I think we were both hoping the other would offer some rational explanation. When we finally did talk, we discovered we'd both been having the same dreams. In these dreams, we were in some kind of room with curved walls that seemed to glow from within. There were tall, hairy creatures moving around us, like what we'd seen in the woods, but somehow different, more purposeful in their movements. They never hurt us in the dreams, just examined us with tools I couldn't quite make out. The dreams were vivid, consistent, and terrifying. The physical symptoms faded after about a week, but the dreams continued for months. Eventually, we both sought help, separately at first, then together with a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma. She diagnosed us with PTSD and suggested our minds had constructed elaborate scenarios to deal with what she assumed was a bear encounter. But we know what we saw, what we experienced. It wasn't a bear. A few weeks after it happened, we worked up the courage to go back in daylight with a couple other friends. Our tent was still there, collapsed and torn. Our fishing gear was scattered across the shore. But the strangest thing was the trees where I'd shot at the creature. There were bullet holes in the trunk, and a dark substance dried in the grooves of the bark. Not sap, it was too dark, almost black. And not quite blood either, at least not like any blood I've seen. We never went camping again after that. Marcus moved to California a year later, said he couldn't handle the woods of Ohio anymore. We've stayed in touch, but we rarely talk about that night. When we do, it's always in this careful, guarded way, like we're afraid saying too much might summon it back. I still live in Ohio, but I never go near Porter County. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find others who've had similar experiences in that area. There are a few reports of strange lights, a couple vague accounts of Bigfoot-like creatures, but nothing that matches exactly what we saw and felt. The doctors, the therapists, they all say the same thing, that trauma can create false memories, that the mind fills in gaps with things it can process. Maybe they're right, but they weren't there. They didn't see that thing standing between the trees. They didn't feel that unnatural calm while staring at a light that shouldn't exist. And they don't wake up at 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, still feeling the sensation of being watched by something ancient and patient, something that's still out there, waiting. Sometimes I wonder if it followed us home that night, if part of it is still with us, observing through our eyes. And in my darkest moments, I wonder if we ever truly left that lake at all.